Hello and welcome to Sleep Tales. Tonight's story is a long and gentle one, made for rest. Find a comfortable place, close your eyes, and let your mind drift. There is no need to try and remember everything. Just allow the words to create a calm space for you. We are going to a place high above the world, a place of quiet work and soft light. Let us begin our journey to the home of the weaver of Cloudhaven. Her name was Seren, and her home was a cloud. It was not a cloud like the others that drifted across the great blue expanse. This cloud was her own, a permanent and gentle island in the sky named Cloudhaven. It was always sun-kissed, always warm, and tethered in its place by unseen, ancient forces. Seren had lived on Cloudhaven for all of her 23 years, and she knew its every soft curve and gentle swell. The ground beneath her feet was not solid like rock or soil. It was firm but yielding, like a thick blanket of fresh snow, and it held the warmth of the sun long after dusk. Her cottage was a small and cozy thing, nestled in the center of the cloud. It was not built of wood or stone. Its walls were made of densely compacted cloud stuff, the same material as her island home, but hardened over centuries until it was smooth and pearly white. The roof was a delicate weaving of captured starlight, and on clear nights, it would glow faintly with a soft, silver light. Inside, the cottage was one simple, round room. There was a bed in one corner, a soft mound of the finest cloud fluff covered with a blanket woven from the deep blue of the twilight sky. A small wooden table and a single chair stood near the wall, made from the wood of a tree that had long ago grown so tall its branches had touched the clouds. But the most important thing in the cottage, the thing that took up nearly half the space, was her loom. It was a great and ancient loom, its frame made of the same dark, smooth wood as the table, but inlaid with strips of pure, polished silver that caught the light. This loom was her life's work, her purpose, and her companion. She was never truly alone, though. She had Nimbus. Nimbus was a cat, but he was not made of fur and bone. He was made entirely of mist, a silent, winged creature who was her constant shadow. He had the shape of a cat, but it was a shape that was always shifting, always soft at the edges. When a breeze drifted across Cloudhaven, Nimbus would ripple and sway. He made no sound, not a purr nor a meow, but Seren understood him perfectly. His silence was a language all its own. When he was content, he would curl up at her feet, a small, dense ball of white vapor. When he was curious, he would stretch long and thin, his misty wings extending as he floated to the edge of the cloud to peer at the world below. His eyes were 2 points of clearer, brighter light within his form, and they followed Seren everywhere she went. He was her friend, her family, and the quiet keeper of her solitude. Seren's job was a vital one. She was the celestial weaver, the mender of the skies. From her high vantage point, she could see the great fabric of the sky as it truly was, a vast and intricate blanket stretched over the world. And like any well-used blanket, it sometimes frayed. Storms could tear it, winds could wear it thin, and time itself could cause its colors to fade. It was Seren's duty to maintain its integrity. Her life was a cycle, a peaceful and predictable rhythm set by the sun and the moon. Each morning, she would wake with the first rays of dawn, painting the inside of her cottage a soft rose gold. She would step outside with Nimbus, and together they would walk the perimeter of Cloudhaven, their feet making no sound on the soft cloud ground. Seren would gaze out, her eyes scanning the vast blue canvas. She knew the sky intimately, every wisp and curl, every shade of blue from the pale, milky color at the horizon to the deep, rich indigo of the high heavens. She could spot a weakness from miles away, a place where the blue was a little too transparent, a spot where a cloud had grown thin and ragged at the edges. Her tools were as unique as her job. Her threads were not made of wool or cotton. She worked with the very light of the heavens. For her day mending, she would gather sunbeams. This was a delicate task. She would hold a special crystal, a clear and multifaceted stone, and turn it just so in the morning light. The crystal would catch the sun and split it into its component parts, a cascade of pure, warm light. With gentle, practiced hands, Seren would coax the golden threads from the crystal, winding them carefully onto a spool made of polished silver. The sunbeam thread was warm to the touch, impossibly fine, and it glowed with a soft, internal light. It was perfect for patching the bright blue fabric of the daytime sky and for reinforcing the brilliant white of the sun-drenched clouds. Her other thread was spun from moonlight. After the sun had set and the world below was settling into darkness, Seren would begin her night work. She would place a wide, shallow bowl of pure silver on the ground and fill it with water collected from the morning dew. The full moon would pour its light down, and the light would pool in the bowl, turning the water into liquid silver. Seren would dip her hands into the cool, luminous water and draw out long, shimmering threads of moonlight. This thread was cool and soft, with a gentle, calming glow. She used it to mend the dark velvet of the night sky and to stitch the first stars into place each evening, making sure they were secure in the blanket of dusk. Her life was this work. It was peace. It was solitude. It was endless repetition. She would wake, she would survey the sky, she would gather her light, and she would work at her loom. The shuttle would pass back and forth, a quiet and rhythmic sound that was the heartbeat of her days. She would weave patches of perfect blue or fluffy white or deep indigo. Then she would take her finished work and, with Nimbus floating beside her, she would guide a small piece of Cloudhaven to the place that needed mending. She would carefully stitch the patch into place with her silver needle, her movements sure and graceful, until the tear or the thin spot was gone, and the sky was whole and beautiful once more. She felt a deep contentment in this life. She loved the feel of the sunbeam thread in her hands, the quiet company of Nimbus, the immense and beautiful view from her home. But lately, a new feeling had begun to sprout inside her, like a tiny, determined seed. It was a feeling of curiosity. For her entire life, the world below had been an abstract painting, a beautiful but distant pattern of green, blue, and brown. She had never felt the solid earth beneath her feet, never smelled a flower, never heard the sound of a river. As she worked, she would find her gaze lingering on the world below. She would wonder what it was like to walk in the deep green of the forests she saw, or to feel the water of the great blue oceans. The seed of curiosity was small, but it was growing, watered by the endless, silent expanse that separated her world from the one so very far below. Chapter 1. A Tear in the Pattern. The day began like every other day Seren had ever known. The sun rose, a great warm presence that gently woke the sky. Its light filtered through the starlight roof of her cottage, and she opened her eyes. Nimbus was a small, condensed puff of mist on the floor beside her bed. As she sat up, he stirred, his form expanding and softening. She smiled, a quiet and gentle expression, and got to her feet. The air in the cottage was cool and clean, tasting faintly of ozone and fresh dew. She pushed open the door, a simple round cutout in the pearly wall, and stepped outside. The whole of her world, Cloudhaven, was bathed in the golden light of a new morning. Far below, the surface of the larger world was a swirl of white clouds, hiding the land from her view. This was normal. The morning clouds were like a blanket that the world pulled over itself as it slept. Soon, the sun would warm them and they would burn away, revealing the patchwork of continents and oceans. Seren stretched her arms to the sky, feeling the sun on her face. It was a familiar, comforting warmth. Her first task of the day was always the same: a walk around the edge of her cloud island. Nimbus floated silently at her side, his misty wings catching the light. Serene's eyes were not idle. She was working. She scanned the horizon, her gaze sweeping across the vast dome of the sky. She was looking for imperfections, for any sign of wear from the night. She saw a small fraying in the west, where the deep blue of late night met the pale orange of dawn. It was a minor thing, a few loose threads of color. She made a mental note to mend it later. She continued her walk, her bare feet pressing into the soft, springy surface of the cloud. She reached the northern edge of Cloudhaven and paused, looking down. A gap in the lower clouds gave her a glimpse of the world. She saw a deep, vibrant green, the color of a dense forest, and a sliver of brilliant blue that she knew was a lake. The colors were so intense, so solid. Her own world was made of soft whites and golds and pale blues. The world below was made of powerful, deep colors. She wondered what it would feel like to touch that green, to put her hand in that blue water. The thought was a fleeting one, a gentle tug of curiosity that she had grown accustomed to. She pushed it aside and continued her work. Back in her cottage, she began to prepare for the day's mending. The fraying in the west was a small job, but she would treat it with the same care as any other. She took out her gathering crystal and walked to the eastern edge of Cloudhaven, where the morning sun was brightest. She held the crystal up, angling it until a perfect, brilliant beam of light passed through it. On the other side, a rainbow of light splayed out onto the white surface of the cloud. Seren focused on the golden yellow band of light. It was the purest part of the sunbeam, the strongest and the warmest. With movements that were as natural to her as breathing, she reached out and gently took the end of a thread of light. It felt like warm silk in her fingers. She began to wind it onto her silver spool, her hands moving in a steady, practiced rhythm. The crystal continued to split the sunlight, and Seren continued to gather the golden thread, spooling it carefully until she had enough for the day's repairs. She carried the glowing spool back to her loom. The great loom was ready. She took the end of the sunbeam thread and tied it to the existing warp threads, the long vertical strings that formed the foundation of any weaving. She sat on the bench, her feet finding the familiar wooden pedals on the floor. With a soft push, she changed the position of the warp threads, creating a small gap. She took the shuttle, a smooth, boat-shaped piece of wood, and passed the sunbeam thread through the gap. Then she pressed the other pedal, and the threads shifted again, locking the new thread in place. She pulled a heavy wooden bar, the beater, toward her, pressing the new thread tightly against the one before it. The process was a slow, meditative dance. Press, pass, press, pull. Each movement was precise and full of purpose. A small patch of pure golden blue fabric began to grow on the loom. It was the color of the sky at its most perfect, woven from the light of the sun itself. As she worked, her mind was quiet. This was her purpose. The sky was vast and she was small, but she had her part to play. Without her, the small phrase would become large tears, and the world would lose its beautiful, protective blanket. Nimbus had settled near the loom. a silent white puddle of mist, his bright eyes watching her hands as they moved. After an hour, the patch was complete. It was a small square of woven light about the size of her hand. It shimmered with a gentle internal warmth. She carefully cut it from the loom, the severed ends of the thread dissolving into tiny motes of light. She took the patch and her silver needle and stepped outside. Nimbus stirred and floated up to her shoulder. Now came the part of her job that required her to travel. She walked to the edge of Cloudhaven and looked toward the fraying she had seen earlier. It was far away, but her home was not an ordinary cloud. She placed her hands on the edge of the cloud and focused her thoughts. She thought about the place in the west, about the weak spot in the sky. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Cloudhaven began to move. It drifted silently through the air, a small private island navigating the vast ocean of the sky. It was a slow journey. Seren sat at the edge, her legs dangling over the side, the patch of woven light resting in her lap. She watched as other clouds, great aimless castles of white, drifted past. She saw the world below, the pattern of green and blue and brown slowly shifting as she moved. The curiosity returned, stronger this time. She saw a long brown ribbon snaking through a green patch. A road, perhaps. She wondered where it led. She saw tiny dark specks moving on the road. What were they? Creatures? People? The words were just sounds to her, concepts she had no experience with. She knew them only as abstract ideas. The thought of a person, another being like her but not like her, who lived on that solid ground, was a strange and powerful one. They arrived at the frayed place. From up close, she could see it clearly. A section of the sky, about as wide as her cottage, had grown thin. The color was pale, and loose threads of blue and gold drifted at the edges, like an old piece of cloth starting to unravel. It was a simple fix. She guided Cloudhaven until it was right beside the weak spot. The air here felt different, thinner. She took her silver needle, threaded it with a long strand of sunbeam she had left on the spool, and began to work. She was like a surgeon, carefully stitching the edges of the tear together. Her hands moved with a deftness born of a lifetime of practice. She pulled the unraveling threads back into the main fabric, securing them with tiny, invisible stitches. Once the edges were secure, she took the patch she had woven. She placed it over the thinned area, and it seemed to sigh into place, the patch and the sky recognizing each other. With her needle, she stitched the patch to the sky, her movements a blur of grace and precision. The sunbeam thread melted into the fabric, becoming one with it, leaving no seam, no mark of the repair. When she was finished, the sky was whole again. The color was a deep and uniform blue. No one in the world below would ever know that it had been damaged, no one but her. She felt a quiet satisfaction. The world was safe. The sky was strong. She guided Cloudhaven back to its usual place in the sky and spent the rest of the afternoon in quiet contemplation. She polished the silver inlays on her loom until they shone. She brushed her long hair, which was the color of pale moonlight. She sat with Nimbus, stroking his misty form, feeling the cool, damp sensation against her palm. But the feeling of wonder, the curiosity about the world below, did not fade as it usually did. It lingered. She found herself at the edge of the cloud more often than not, just staring down. The world seemed more detailed today, more real. She saw shapes that she started to recognize as mountains, their peaks sharp against the sky. She saw the way the light glinted off the surface of the vast ocean. The world was not just a painting. It was a place that was alive. A deep, quiet part of her that she had never heard from before began to ask a question. What is it like? What is it like to be down there? The question was a whisper, but it echoed in the silence of her world. This new feeling stayed with her as the day began to fade. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink and purple. It was time for her evening work. She set out the wide silver bowl and filled it with dew. As the moon began to rise, a perfect white disk in the darkening sky, she gathered her moonlight thread. It was a different process, slower and more gentle than gathering sunbeams. The moonlight was shy. She had to be patient, coaxing the silver threads from the water. They were cool and smooth in her hands, and they seemed to absorb the silence of the night. Her task tonight was simple: to secure the first stars. As dusk settled, the brightest stars began to appear. To a casual observer, they simply blinked into existence. But Seren saw the truth. Each star was a point of light that needed to be anchored to the fabric of the night sky. She would take a single long strand of moonlight thread, and with a flick of her wrist, she would cast it out toward a newly appearing star. The thread would wrap around the point of light, and she would pull it gently, setting it firmly in its place in the great velvet blanket. She did this for a dozen of the brightest stars, her silver thread arcing through the twilight until the evening constellations were secure and shining brightly. It was after she had finished her work that the sky began to change. A deep darkness was gathering in the east. It was not the gentle, welcoming darkness of night. It was a heavy, bruised-looking blackness that was eating the stars. The wind, which was usually a gentle sigh around Cloudhaven, began to pick up. It whipped at her hair and whistled past her cottage. Nimbus, who was usually so calm, condensed himself into a tight, low ball at her feet, his misty form pressed against her ankles. Seren had seen storms before. They were a natural part of the sky. But this was different. This storm felt angry. A low rumble started, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the sky. It grew louder, becoming a roar that vibrated through the cloud beneath her feet. Flashes of brilliant, jagged light tore through the blackness, followed by explosive claps of thunder that were so loud she felt them in her bones. Rain began to fall, not the gentle, life-giving rain she sometimes saw, but a hard, driving downpour that hammered against her home. She retreated inside her cottage, pulling the door shut against the raging wind. The storm was all around them. The light from the lightning flashes lit up the inside of her cottage, casting long, dancing shadows. The thunder was a constant, deafening roar. Even inside, she could feel the fury of the storm. Cloudhaven, her stable, peaceful home, was being tossed and shaken. Seren was not afraid, not for herself. She and her home were ancient and strong, but she was worried for the sky. She could feel the strain on the fabric of the heavens. It was being stretched, torn, and battered. This was a storm that would do great damage. There was nothing she could do but wait for it to pass. She sat on her bed with Nimbus in her lap, his misty body a cool weight. She closed her eyes and listened to the symphony of destruction outside. For hours the storm raged. It felt like the world was being torn apart. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it started to fade. The roar of the thunder softened to a distant grumble. The flashes of lightning became less frequent. The hammering of the rain eased into a gentle patter and then stopped altogether. Silence descended, a deep and profound quiet that felt strange after the noise of the storm. Seren waited a few more moments before she dared to open her door. When she did, the air was cool and clean, washed by the rain. The storm clouds were retreating, a mass of dark gray on the western horizon. The moon was out again, casting a gentle silver light over her cloud. But as she stepped outside and looked up, her breath caught in her throat. There, directly above her, was a tear. It was not a small fray or a thin patch. It was a great gaping rent in the fabric of the night sky. It was a jagged, ugly wound, and through it, she could see the absolute blackness of the empty space beyond. The storm had ripped the sky open. It was the worst damage she had ever seen in her life. It would take her weeks, maybe months, to weave a patch large enough to mend it. Her heart ached at the sight of the wounded sky. She looked down through the massive tear, expecting to see the usual pattern of the darkened land and the shimmering sea. But she saw something else, something that made her forget, for a moment, the damage to the sky. Directly below the tear on the land was a village. She could see the small, clustered shapes of houses and the faint, flickering lights of lamps or candles. But the village and the land around it were shrouded in a strange, persistent grayness. It was not a fog or a mist. It was a dullness, a lack of color, as if the life had been drained from the very earth. The moonlight, which was shining so brightly everywhere else, did not seem to touch this place. It stopped at the edge of the grayness, unable to penetrate the gloom. The lights in the village were small and weak, struggling against a heavy, oppressive sadness that she could feel even from her great height. The rest of the world was recovering from the storm, washed clean and peaceful under the moon. But this one small corner of it was sick. A feeling she had never experienced before washed over her. It was not contentment, and it was not curiosity. It was a deep, powerful sense of responsibility. Her job had always been to mend the sky, to keep the blanket whole. But now she saw that the blanket was not just a thing in itself. It was a cover for the world below. And the tear in the sky was connected somehow to the sickness on the land. The unraveling above was mirrored by a fading below. She could patch the hole. She could spend weeks at her loom, weaving a new piece of the night and stitch it into place. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her heart, that it would not be enough. The problem was not just in the sky. It was in the land. The sickness, the gray sickness as she named it in her mind, was the source. Mending the sky from above would be like putting a bandage on a deep wound. It would not heal it. The decision was made in that instant. It was not a choice that she weighed or considered. It was a simple, undeniable truth that bloomed in her mind. She had to go down there. She had to leave Cloudhaven. She, the weaver of the sky, had to touch the earth. For the first time in her life, she had to venture into the world she was charged with protecting. The thought was terrifying. Her home was safe, predictable, and known. The world below was a vast and terrifying mystery. But the image of that sad, gray village was burned into her mind. She could not ignore it. She could not turn away and simply mend the fabric above while the world below suffered. Her purpose, which had always seemed so clear and simple, had just become infinitely more complex. With a new and steely resolve, she went back into her cottage. She would need a way to get down and a way to get back. She looked at her loom, at the spools of thread. Sunbeam thread was strong, but it was light. Moonlight thread was soft and gentle. Neither would be strong enough on its own. She took a spool of each. She sat down, not at her loom, but on the floor. She took the end of the sunbeam thread and the end of the moonlight thread, and with careful, nimble fingers, she began to weave them together. She did not use a tool, only her hands. She twisted and braided the two threads of light, one warm and golden, the other cool and silver. They coiled around each other, merging, creating a single rope that shimmered with a beautiful, otherworldly light. It was a rope made of day and night, of warmth and coolness, of the sun and the moon. It was incredibly strong, stronger than any single thread could ever be. She worked through the night, the only light coming from the glowing rope she was creating. Nimbus sat beside her, a silent, watchful presence. He seemed to understand that something was changing, that their peaceful, predictable life was about to end. When the rope was long enough, so long that its end disappeared into the darkness below, she tied one end securely to the base of her loom, the heaviest and most solid thing in her world. Then, she prepared for her journey. She did not have many possessions. She took a small leather pouch and placed inside it a small, tightly wound spool of her best sunbeam thread. It was a piece of her skill, a piece of her work. She added her favorite silver needle, the one she used for the most delicate repairs. It was a piece of her craft. Finally, she went to the edge of Cloudhaven and scooped up a small, dense piece of the cloud itself. It was cool and soft in her hand, like holding a piece of her own home. She tucked it into the pouch. With these three things, her skill, her craft, and her home, she felt as ready as she could ever be. She put the pouch on a cord and slung it over her shoulder. The first light of dawn was beginning to touch the sky. The tear was still there, a jagged wound against the pale morning light. The gray village was still there below, a patch of sorrow in the waking world. It was time. Seren walked to the edge of Cloudhaven, where the shimmering rope descended into the depths. Nimbus floated up and settled onto her shoulder, his misty form a familiar comfort. She took a deep breath, the clean, thin air of the upper atmosphere filling her lungs. She looked at her cottage one last time, at her loom, at the only world she had ever known. Then, with her heart beating a fast, nervous rhythm against her ribs, she took hold of the rope of woven light and stepped off the edge of the cloud. She began her long, slow descent to the solid ground below. Chapter 2. The Feeling of the Ground. The descent was a slow fall into a new world. Seren held the rope of woven light tightly, its surface smooth and cool beneath her hands. Cloudhaven, her home, grew smaller and smaller above her, a familiar white island shrinking in the vast blue sea of the sky. The wind was different here, below the highest levels of the atmosphere. It was thicker, carrying with it strange new feelings and a sense of weight. She passed through the first layer of clouds, the thin, wispy ones she often saw from above. From the outside, they were like delicate brushstrokes of white paint. Passing through them was like moving through a cold, damp fog. Tiny ice crystals clung to her hair and clothes, melting into droplets of pure, clean water. Nimbus, perched on her shoulder, seemed to shrink into himself, his misty form becoming denser to ward off the chill. He was a silent, anxious weight, his presence a small comfort in the great, empty space. Lower she went, the rope sliding through her hands at a steady pace. The world of the sky, her world, was a place of vast, open views. Here, as she descended, her view was often blocked by the clouds she was passing through. She entered a great, puffy white cloud, the kind that looked like a mountain of fluff from her home. Inside, it was a world of absolute white. She could see nothing but the shimmering rope in front of her and the white mist all around. The light was diffused and gentle, and the air was thick with moisture. It was a strange and disorienting experience. She was used to working on the outside of these clouds, patching their sun-bleached tops. To be inside one was to be lost in its very substance. She felt a flicker of fear, a feeling of being blind and untethered, even though the rope was firm in her hands. She held on tighter and continued her descent, trusting the rope, trusting her decision. She emerged from the bottom of the cloud into clear air again. The world below was much closer now. It was no longer an abstract pattern of colors. She could see details. The green was not one single color, but 1,000 different shades, from the dark green of deep forests to the bright, fresh green of open fields. The blue of the water was not just blue. It was dark in the deep parts and pale near the shore, with lines of white where waves broke. She saw the village she had seen from above. It was still covered in that strange, dull grayness, a stain on the otherwise vibrant landscape. Seeing it from this closer perspective only strengthened her resolve. The sickness was real. It was not a trick of the light. The air grew warmer as she got lower. It also grew heavier, filled with things she could not see but could feel. There were scents, faint at first, then growing stronger. A smell of damp earth, rich and dark. A smell of green, living things. These were smells she had no names for, but they filled her senses, replacing the clean, thin scent of her home. The sounds were changing too. The silence of the upper air was gone. A low, constant humming sound reached her ears, the sound of 1,000,000 tiny things living and moving. There was the sound of wind, but it was different. It was not the pure, open sound of wind in the sky. This wind rustled and whispered, making a dry, shushing sound as it passed through the leaves of the trees she was now approaching. The trees were immense. From Cloudhaven, they had looked like a soft green carpet. Now she saw they were giants, each one a massive living structure reaching for the sky she had just left. Her rope of light passed close to the branches of one of the tallest trees. On an impulse, she reached out a free hand and touched a leaf. The sensation was a shock. It was soft, but also firm, with a network of tiny, hard veins running through it. It was cool and slightly damp. It was real, a small, solid piece of the world. She had spent her life weaving with threads of light, an ethereal and weightless material. This leaf, this small green thing, had more substance and texture than anything she had ever touched before. Her feet touched the ground. The moment was so sudden, so unexpected, that she almost lost her grip on the rope. For her entire life, every surface she had stood on had a soft, yielding quality. Cloudhaven was firm, but gentle, like standing on a dense cushion. This new surface was completely different. It was hard. It was solid. It did not yield to her weight at all. It pushed back with an unmoving, absolute force. She stood still for a long moment, her bare feet planted in the soft green grass, simply feeling the sensation of the ground. It was the most shocking feeling she had ever experienced. The world did not move. It was fixed, stable, and incredibly solid. She let go of the rope, which dangled beside her, its light shimmering in the dappled sunlight of the forest clearing she had landed in. Nimbus floated from her shoulder and hovered near the ground, his misty form rippling as he cautiously explored the strange new surface without actually touching it. Seren took a tentative step. Her foot pressed down on the grass, and she could feel the individual blades bending beneath her weight. She could feel the soft, damp soil underneath the grass. She took another step, and then another, a slow, wondrous walk of discovery. She had landed in a small meadow, a circle of bright green grass surrounded by the tall, silent trees. Wildflowers grew in vibrant clusters, splashes of brilliant color, deep purple, bright yellow, fiery red. The colors were so intense they almost hurt her eyes. Her world was one of pale, gentle hues. This world was bursting with a fierce, untamed palette. She knelt down and touched the petal of a yellow flower. It was as soft as a moth's wing, impossibly delicate, yet it held its bright color with a bold confidence. Then, the full force of the world's sensations washed over her. It was an overwhelming flood. The smells she had noticed on her way down were 1,000 times stronger here. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, of crushed leaves, of the sweet perfume of the flowers. There was a smell of decay, a rich and complex odor from a fallen log, and a clean, sharp scent from a pine tree. Her whole life, she had breathed air that smelled of nothing but clouds and ozone. This air was a heavy soup of 1,000,000 different smells, each one telling a story she did not understand. She breathed it in deeply, feeling a strange mix of confusion and delight. And the sounds. The world was so loud. In her home, the only sounds were the gentle whisper of the wind and the soft thumping of her loom. Here, the air was alive with noise. Birds were singing from the high branches of the trees, not with one voice, but with dozens of different calls and songs, a complex and beautiful music that was all around her. Insects buzzed, a constant, low-frequency hum that formed a background to all the other sounds. The wind rustled the leaves, a sound like 1,000 tiny paper hands clapping. She heard a twig snap in the distance, a sharp, sudden crack that made her jump. She could even hear the sound of her own breathing, a small, quiet sound lost in the great chorus of the living world. The silence she was used to was not an absence of sound. She now realized it was an absence of life. This world was filled with the noise of life. She continued her exploration of the small meadow, her senses reeling. She ran her hand down the trunk of a large tree. The bark was rough and deeply grooved, scratching against her soft palm. It was nothing like the smooth, pearly walls of her cottage. It felt ancient and strong. She picked up a small, smooth stone from the ground. It was cool to the touch and surprisingly heavy, a small piece of the world's immense weight in her hand. Everything here had texture, weight, and substance. She was used to a world of light and air, a world that was soft at the edges. This world was made of hard, solid things. It was a place of sharp edges and rough surfaces. A small creature, a rabbit with long ears and soft brown fur, hopped into the meadow. It stopped and looked at her, its nose twitching. Seren froze, her heart beating fast. She had never been so close to another living creature other than Nimbus. The rabbit's eyes were dark and bright. After a moment, it turned and hopped away, a flash of white tail disappearing into the bushes. The encounter left her breathless. The world was not just full of plants and sounds. It was full of other beings, moving and living with a purpose of their own. Nimbus, who had been floating near the ground, drifted closer to her, his form a little less stable than usual. This world of solid, fast-moving things was as strange to him as it was to her. She was so absorbed in her discovery of the ground that she did not notice the man until he was standing at the edge of the meadow. He was a young man, not much older than her. He carried a large basket filled with dark, lumpy vegetables. He had stopped when he saw her, and now he was just standing there, watching her with a look of pure astonishment. Seren saw him, and her first instinct was to run, to grab her rope of light and pull herself back up to the safety of the sky. But she did not move. There was something in his eyes that held her in place. It was not fear or anger. It was curiosity and a deep, gentle kindness. His name was Kael, though she did not know that yet. He was a farmer, and he had been checking his vegetable patch on the other side of the woods when he saw a strange, shimmering light descending from the sky. He had followed it cautiously to this meadow, and now he was looking at the most unusual person he had ever seen. She was dressed in clothes that seemed to be woven from pale light, and her hair was the color of the moon. A small, strange cat made of swirling mist floated near her shoulder, and a rope of shimmering light hung from the sky, ending on the grass beside her. He did not understand what he was seeing, but he could see that she was not a threat. She looked lost, and more than a little overwhelmed. He took a slow step forward, holding up one hand to show he meant no harm. Seren flinched, but she did not run. He was tall and strong, his body shaped by a life of physical work. His skin was tanned by the sun, and his hands were rough and calloused. He was a creature of the solid earth, the complete opposite of her airy existence. He said something, but the words were just sounds to her, a gentle and questioning tone, but with no meaning she could grasp. She just stared at him, her eyes wide. She was a mender of the sky, a weaver of light. She did not know how to speak to a man of the earth. Kael saw the fear and confusion in her eyes. He stopped walking and slowly lowered himself to sit on the grass, making himself smaller and less threatening. He set his basket down beside him. He did not speak again. He just sat there, patiently, giving her time to get used to his presence. He had a calm and steady energy about him, like the old trees that surrounded the meadow. Seren watched him for a long time. She watched the way he sat, comfortable and at ease on the solid ground. She watched his chest rise and fall with each slow breath. He was not going to hurt her. She felt this with a deep certainty. Slowly, very slowly, she took a step toward him. Nimbus drifted along with her, a silent, misty guardian. Kael did not move. He just watched her with his kind, steady eyes. She stopped a few feet away from him. He reached into his basket and took out a small loaf of dark bread. He broke it in half and held one piece out to her, an offering. Seren looked at the bread. It was a lumpy, brown object. She had never eaten anything solid in her life. Her nourishment came from the dew she collected and the faint, sweet energy she absorbed from the starlight. The idea of putting this solid, earthy thing into her body was strange and a little frightening, but it was a gesture of peace. She could see that. She reached out a trembling hand and took the piece of bread. It was still warm. The crust was rough and hard, and it was dusted with a fine white powder. It smelled rich and nutty. She looked at Kael, and he nodded, giving her a small, encouraging smile. He took a bite of his own piece of bread to show her what to do. Hesitantly, Seren lifted the bread to her lips and took a small bite. The taste was an explosion in her mouth. It was earthy and salty and slightly sweet. The texture was incredible, a hard crust giving way to a soft, chewy inside. It was the most intense, most wonderful flavor she had ever experienced. It tasted of the sun that had grown the wheat, of the earth it had grown in, of the fire that had baked it. It tasted of the solid world. She took another bite, and then another. A feeling of warmth spread through her stomach, a grounding, comforting feeling she had never known. Kael smiled again when he saw her eating the bread. He reached into his basket again and pulled out a bright red apple. He polished it on his shirt and held it out to her. She took it. It was smooth and cool in her hand, and it had a clean, sweet smell. She took a bite. There was a loud, crisp snap, and her mouth was filled with a rush of sweet, tangy juice. The flavor was sharp and clean, completely different from the bread, but just as wonderful. It was like tasting a drop of pure liquid sunlight. She ate the whole apple, the juice running down her chin. She felt a connection to this world through its food, a feeling of being a part of it in a way she had not been before. When she was finished, Kael stood up slowly. He picked up his basket. He looked at her, and then he gestured toward the path he had come from, a clear invitation for her to follow him. Seren hesitated. Her rope was here, her connection to her home. To leave it would be to put her trust completely in this stranger. But he had shown her nothing but kindness. He had fed her, and she knew she could not stay in this meadow forever. She needed to understand this world and to understand the gray sickness that afflicted the village. This man, this kind and gentle man of the earth, was her only guide. She looked at the shimmering rope one last time, a silent promise that she would return. Then she nodded to Kael. With Nimbus floating at her side, she followed him out of the meadow and onto the path that led to his home. The walk was short, but for Seren it was filled with more new experiences. The path was narrow and uneven, and she had to watch her step carefully. The solid ground was still a new and strange thing, and she stumbled a few times. Kael walked with a sure and easy stride, his feet knowing the path perfectly. They walked under the canopy of the tall trees, and the sunlight filtered down through the leaves, creating moving patterns of light and shadow on the ground. The air was cool and smelled of damp moss and rich soil. It was like walking through a great green hall. They came to the edge of the forest, and Kael's home came into view. It was a small, simple house, but to Seren it was a marvel. It was made of dark wood and gray stone, solid, heavy materials pulled from the earth itself. A thin stream of smoke rose from a stone chimney, disappearing into the blue sky. A small garden grew beside the house, with neat rows of green plants. It was a place that was deeply connected to the land, a part of it. Her own cottage was a thing of the sky, light and airy and barely tethered to anything. This house was the opposite. It was rooted, solid, and permanent. Kael led her to the front of the house. There was a heavy wooden door. He lifted a latch, and the door swung open with a soft, groaning sound. He gestured for her to go inside. Seren paused at the threshold. The inside of the house was dark compared to the bright sunlight outside. To step inside felt like a momentous act. It was to enter a place completely enclosed, a small, solid box in the middle of the vast, open world. She had never been inside anything like it. Her cottage had walls of pearly cloud, and light filtered through them. This house had solid walls that blocked the world out completely. With a deep breath, she stepped over the threshold and into the house. The inside was one main room, much like her own cottage, but the feeling was entirely different. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and cooking. The light came from a single, small window and from the open door. A stone hearth stood against one wall, a low fire glowing within it. This was the source of the warmth and the smoky smell. A simple wooden bed with a thick, patched quilt stood in a corner. A sturdy wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. Iron pots and pans hung from hooks on the wall. Everything was simple, handmade, and well used, and everything was heavy. The table was made of thick planks of wood. The pots were made of black iron. This was a world of weight and substance. Seren stood in the middle of the room, turning in a slow circle, taking it all in. The feeling of being inside was the strangest thing of all. The solid roof above her head was a completely new sensation. For her entire life, she had always had the open sky above her, even when she was in her cottage with its roof of woven starlight. To be under a solid roof, a roof that she could not see through, felt like being in a cave. It was not frightening, but it was confining. It made the world feel small and close. She felt protected, but also trapped. Kael seemed to understand her discomfort. He walked over to the single window and pushed open the wooden shutters, letting more light and air into the room. It helped a little. He then went to the hearth and added a small piece of wood to the fire. It crackled and a few bright sparks flew up. He moved with a quiet competence, a man who was completely at home in his solid, earthy world. He did not try to speak to her again. He just let her be, giving her space to adjust to this strange new environment. He started to clean the vegetables from his basket, his movements slow and methodical. Seren drifted over to the table and touched its surface. It was solid and unmoving, scarred with 100 small cuts and marks from years of use. It had a history. She looked at her own hands, soft and pale, hands made for weaving light. They looked out of place in this world of wood and stone and iron. Nimbus had floated into the room behind her and was now hovering near the ceiling, his misty form spread thin, as if trying to stay as close to the sky as possible, even with a solid roof in the way. They did not communicate with words. They did not need to. Seren pointed out the window toward the sky, and then made a motion with her hands like something tearing. She then pointed in the direction of the gray village. She was trying to explain why she was here, to show him the connection between the wounded sky and the sick land. Kael watched her gestures carefully. He looked up at the sky, and then he looked toward the village. A shadow of understanding and of sadness crossed his face. He nodded slowly. He did not understand where she had come from or how she had gotten here. But he understood that she had come to fix the grayness. He understood that she was here to help. He pointed to himself and then to her, and then made a walking motion with his fingers on the table, a simple message: "We will go together." A silent agreement was made between the weaver of the sky and the farmer of the earth. Their journey to find the source of the gray sickness had already begun. Chapter 3. The Gray Sickness. Seren's first night on the solid ground was a long journey through new feelings. She lay on the simple bed Kael had offered her. It was not a bed of soft cloud fluff that molded perfectly to her shape. It was a mattress stuffed with dry straw that rustled with every small movement. A heavy patched quilt covered her, a weight she was not used to. In her home on Cloudhaven, her blanket was woven from twilight and was almost weightless. This quilt felt like a piece of the earth itself, pinning her down, reminding her with its gentle pressure that she was no longer in her own world. The small cottage was filled with a deep darkness that was different from the darkness of the night sky. The night sky was vast and open, filled with the distant, silent light of stars. This darkness was close and contained, bounded by the 4 solid walls of the house. It was the absolute blackness of a sealed space. she could not sleep at first. The world outside the cottage was alive with sounds she had never heard. The gentle, rhythmic chirping of crickets was a constant, peaceful song that filled the night. An owl hooted somewhere in the dark forest, a low, mournful sound that echoed in the stillness. The wind, which in her world was a clean, sweeping force, moved differently here. It whispered and sighed through the leaves of the trees, a constant, soft shushing. It pushed against the solid walls of the cottage, making the wooden frame creak and groan like a sleeping giant. These were the sounds of a world that did not stop when the sun went down. It was a world that breathed and shifted and lived on in the darkness. Seren lay still, listening to the unfamiliar music of the night, feeling the heavy quilt, and slowly, the strangeness began to feel less like a threat and more like a lullaby. Nimbus had settled at the foot of the bed, a condensed and quiet pool of white mist, a small, familiar piece of her own world in this strange new place. She awoke to a thin bar of golden light cutting across the dark room. It was the sunlight, but it was not the all-encompassing light she was used to. It did not fill her home from all directions. It came from one place, a small square cut into the wall. It was the light from the window. She sat up, the straw mattress rustling beneath her. Kael was already awake. He was moving quietly around the small room, his motions efficient and practiced. A small fire was crackling in the stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow on the wooden walls and floor. The air was filled with a new smell, a warm, toasty scent that made her stomach feel a strange, pleasant emptiness. Kael was cooking. He had a flat, black pan made of heavy iron, and in it, he was heating a thin, yellow liquid which he had poured from a clay jug. He moved with a quiet focus, a man performing the simple, necessary rituals of his morning. He saw that she was awake and gave her a small, gentle smile. He finished his cooking, sliding a round, flat yellow cake onto a wooden plate. He placed the plate on the table and gestured for her to join him. Seren got out of bed, her feet feeling the cool, rough wood of the floor. She sat at the table, and he placed the plate in front of her. He then sat down with his own plate. She looked at the food. It was warm, and a faint steam rose from its surface. Using a small wooden fork, she took a bite. The taste was simple and comforting. It was savory, like the earth, but also light and fluffy. It was a taste of warmth and nourishment. Kael also gave her a small bowl of berries he had picked. They were dark purple and burst in her mouth with a sweet, sharp flavor. Eating this food that came from the solid ground, made her feel more connected to this world, more a part of it. It was a quiet meal. No words were spoken, but a sense of companionship grew between them in the shared morning light of the small cottage. After they had finished eating, Kael stood up and went to the door. He looked out at the morning sky, a clear, brilliant blue. Then he looked to the north, and the smile left his face. A faint, hazy grayness was visible on the horizon in that direction. It was the sickness. He turned back to Seren and pointed toward the grayness. He then pointed to his own feet and made a walking motion with his hands. It was time to go. It was time for him to show her what she had only seen from high above. Seren nodded. She felt a knot of apprehension in her stomach, but she pushed it down. This was why she had come. She stood up, and Nimbus floated from his spot on the bed to settle on her shoulder. She was ready. They left the small, warm cottage and stepped out into the bright morning. The air was cool and fresh, filled with the scent of dew on the grass. Kael led the way, and Seren followed. They walked past his small garden, where the plants were green and healthy, their leaves reaching for the sun. They walked along a narrow dirt path that wound its way through open fields. The landscape was beautiful, more beautiful than she could have ever imagined from her home in the sky. The fields were a patchwork of different shades of green and gold. In one field, tall stalks of wheat swayed in the gentle breeze, their tops a sea of pale gold. In another, broad-leafed vegetables grew in neat, dark green rows. The world felt vibrant and alive. The sun was warm on her skin, a familiar and comforting feeling. It was the same sun she had always known, the same sun whose light she wove into her threads. The air was filled with the cheerful sounds of a healthy world. Small yellow birds darted through the air, their songs a cascade of happy notes. Bees and other insects hummed and buzzed as they moved from one wildflower to the next, their legs yellow with pollen. The sound was a constant, gentle thrum of life. Seren walked in a state of quiet wonder. She had seen this world as a silent, distant pattern. To be inside the pattern, to hear its music and feel its warmth, was an overwhelming experience. She paused to look at a spiderweb strung between two tall stalks of grass. It was a miracle of construction, a perfect, intricate net adorned with dozens of tiny dewdrops, each one glittering like a tiny diamond in the morning sun. It was a weaving, just like her own work, but made from a different thread for a different purpose. She felt a sense of connection to the tiny, unseen weaver of this masterpiece. Kael was a patient guide. He seemed to understand her need to stop and look, to touch and to feel. He would wait for her, his expression calm and understanding. He watched as she gently touched the soft, fuzzy leaf of a plant, or as she stared in fascination at a line of ants marching purposefully across the path. For him, these were ordinary things, the everyday details of his world. But seeing them through her eyes, he seemed to be seeing them for the first time as well. He saw the wonder in a simple spiderweb, the beauty in a common wildflower. He saw his world through the eyes of a weaver from the sky, and it was made new again. They walked for more than an hour, moving steadily north. The landscape remained green and full of life. They passed another small farm where a woman was feeding chickens in a dusty yard. The chickens clucked and scratched at the ground, a scene of simple, rustic peace. The woman looked up and waved to Kael, and he waved back. She looked at Seren with curiosity, at her strange, pale clothes and the mist cat on her shoulder, but she smiled a friendly, welcoming smile. This world, Seren thought, was a good world. It was a world worth protecting. Then things began to change. The change was not sudden. It was a slow, subtle draining of life. At first, Seren just felt a slight chill in the air, even though the sun was still bright in the sky. The gentle breeze that had been blowing died away, and the air became still and heavy. The cheerful singing of the birds became less frequent, the notes more hesitant. Then, the bird song stopped altogether. The constant, vibrant hum of the insects faded into a deep and unsettling silence. The only sound now was the soft crunch of their own feet on the dirt path. The colors of the world began to fade as well. The vibrant green of the grass at the side of the path became a duller, more muted shade. The wildflowers were fewer here, and their colors were less intense. A patch of yellow flowers looked pale and washed out, as if the color was being leached out of their petals. Kael's face grew more serious, his steps more deliberate. He knew this land well. He was walking into the heart of the sickness. They came to the top of a small hill, and from there they could see the edge of the gray sickness clearly. It was not a wall of fog, it was a line on the land. On one side, where they stood, the world was green and alive. On the other side, the land was shrouded in a dull, gray-brown haze. The line was stark and unnatural. It cut across fields and over hills, a visible border between health and decay. A strong, healthy tree stood on their side of the line, its leaves a vibrant green. A few feet away, on the other side of the line, stood another tree of the same kind. But this tree was a sad, skeletal thing, its leaves a sickly gray-green, its branches drooping as if in defeat. It was as if all the life and color had been sucked out of the land beyond that invisible line. Seren felt a cold dread creep into her heart. This was the sickness she had seen from her cloud. Up close, it was 1,000 times worse. It was not just a lack of color, it was a lack of life. The sight of it was a physical pain to her, a deep and jarring disharmony in the world. Her entire existence was dedicated to maintaining the beauty and integrity of the sky. This sickness was a direct assault on the very concept of beauty and wholeness. Kael looked at her, his eyes full of a quiet sorrow. He did not need to speak. His expression said everything. This is what we have to face. He took a deep breath and started walking down the hill, toward the edge of the grayness. Seren followed, her heart heavy. Their first steps into the gray sickness were like stepping from a warm, sunlit room into a cold, damp cellar. The change in temperature was immediate. The air became cool and clammy, and a shiver ran down Seren's spine. The warmth of the sun, which had been so pleasant on her skin just moments before, was gone. She looked up. The sun was still there, a bright circle in the sky, but its light seemed to struggle to get through the air here. It was a weak, watery light, like sunlight seen through a dirty window. It provided illumination, but no warmth, no life. There were no sharp shadows here, only a uniform, dim twilight that cast a melancholy pall over everything. Nimbus, on her shoulder, shivered and condensed his form into a tight, solid ball, as if trying to protect himself from the oppressive cold. They walked deeper into the affected area. The silence was absolute. It was not the peaceful silence of her home in the sky. It was a dead silence, an absence of all the small sounds of life that she had just begun to appreciate. There were no birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. The world was holding its breath, and it had been holding it for a very long time. The ground beneath their feet was different too. The soil was dry and crumbly, and the grass was thin and brittle, crunching under their feet like dead leaves. The plants were all weak and stunted. She saw a field that should have been full of healthy crops. Instead, it was filled with withered brown stalks. The vegetables were small and malformed, their colors dull and unappetizing. It was a field of failure, a testament to a harvest that would never come. They passed a small farmhouse. It was in a state of disrepair. The wooden fence was broken in several places, and the garden was overgrown with gray-looking weeds. A thin, pale woman was sitting on the porch, staring out at the dying fields with empty eyes. She did not seem to see them as they walked past. Her face was a mask of quiet despair. A small child stood near her, not playing, not running, just standing still, holding a limp gray flower. The child's face was as pale and expressionless as the mother's. There was no joy here, no energy, no hope. The gray sickness was not just affecting the land, it was affecting the people. It was draining the life and spirit from them, just as it was draining the color from the leaves. Seren's heart ached for these people, for their silent gray suffering. Kael walked with his head down, his jaw tight. He knew these people. They were his neighbors. To see them like this was a source of deep pain for him. Seren stopped in the middle of a dead field. She needed to understand what was happening. Her instinct was to look up. This was her domain. The sky. From the ground, here in the heart of the gloom, the sky looked wrong. It was not just dim, it was thin. As the celestial weaver, she did not just see the sky as a color. She saw it as a fabric, a vast and complex weaving of light and energy. And from this place, she could see that the fabric was failing. The threads were loose. The weave, which should have been tight and strong, was porous and weak. It was like a piece of cloth that had been stretched and worn until it was almost transparent. She understood then why the sunlight felt so weak. The sky was not blocking the light. It was failing to hold it. A healthy sky would catch the sun's light and warmth, holding it like a blanket, spreading it evenly over the world below. But this sky, this weak and unraveling sky, was letting the light slip through. The light was passing through the loose threads, its warmth and energy dissipating into the empty space beyond before it could ever reach the ground. The coldness of this place was not the presence of a dark energy. It was the absence of the sun's life-giving warmth. The fabric of the sky was too thin to contain it. This was a revelation. Her first thought, when she had seen the great tear after the storm, was that she needed to patch a hole. But now she saw the truth. The tear was just a symptom of a much deeper problem. The entire section of the sky above this gray land was unraveling. It was becoming undone. Patching the tear would be useless. The fabric around the patch was too weak to hold the stitches. It would just tear again. The entire section needed to be unraveled and rewoven from scratch. But even that would not be enough. She looked from the weak sky to the sick ground, and she felt it. A connection, a terrible, draining pull from the earth itself. The sickness was not just on the land. It was flowing out of the land. It was rising like a poison mist, invisible to the eye, but she could feel it with every fiber of her being. This poisonous energy was what was causing the sky to unravel. It was eating away at the threads of light from below, dissolving the very structure of her weaving. The sickness of the land was creating the weakness in the sky. The damage had to be mended from the ground up, not from the sky down. The source of the poison had to be found and healed. Only then could the sky be made whole again. Only then would the warmth and color return to this sad, gray place. She turned to Kael, her eyes wide with the enormity of her discovery. How could she explain it to him? She had no words that he would understand. So she used her hands, the hands of a weaver. She pointed to the dry, dead ground beneath their feet. Then she moved her hands upwards, her fingers making a slow, twisting, unraveling motion, like a thread being pulled loose from a piece of cloth. She continued the motion, moving her hands higher and higher until she was pointing at the pale, thin sky above them. She was showing him the flow of the sickness, from the earth to the heavens. Kael watched her gestures, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a man of the earth. He understood the connection between the soil and the plants that grew from it. He understood how a sickness in the roots would lead to a sickness in the leaves. He looked at the ground, then he looked up at the sky, and he saw the truth in her silent explanation. A look of deep understanding dawned on his face. He nodded slowly. he understood that the problem was not in the sky. The problem was here, in the land he called home. His gaze shifted, moving to the north. Through the gray haze, the dark shape of a great mountain was just barely visible. It was a jagged, imposing silhouette against the pale sky, a place of shadows and secrets. He raised his arm and pointed a steady finger toward the mountain. He spoke, and though Seren did not understand the words, the meaning was clear from his tone and his expression. The gray sickness began there. It started at the base of the mountain, a small patch of gray in a green world. But it had grown. It had spread, slowly and relentlessly, like a creeping stain, consuming the land, draining the life from everything it touched. He drew a small circle in the air with his finger, near the mountain. Then he made the circle bigger and bigger and bigger, showing her the slow, insidious expansion of the gloom. He told her, with his gestures and his sad eyes, that people avoided the mountain now. It was a place of fear, a place where the world had started to come undone. They stood there for a long time, in the cold and the silence, looking at the distant, forgotten mountain. It was the source. It was the heart of the sickness. Whatever was poisoning the land, and in turn unraveling the sky, was there. Their path was clear. They had to go to the mountain. They had to find the source of the unraveling and mend it. It was the only way. Kael looked at Seren. He pointed to himself. Then he pointed to her. And then he pointed to the dark mountain on the horizon. It was not a question. It was a statement. A declaration of shared purpose. We will go there. Together. Seren looked at the daunting, shadowy peak. The thought of the journey was terrifying. It was a journey into the heart of the decay, a journey into an unknown and dangerous place. But she also looked at the pale, hopeless faces of the people she had seen. She looked at the dying land. She felt the weakness in the sky she was sworn to protect. There was no other choice. This was her work now. Her purpose was no longer just to mend the sky with threads of light. Her purpose was to mend the world itself. She met Kael's determined gaze, and she gave a single firm nod. Yes, they would go. The weaver of the sky and the farmer of the earth, united by a silent promise to bring the light and life back to their world. Chapter 4. A Journey Under a Fading Sky. The morning of their departure was quiet and still. A thin mist lay over the fields around Kael's small cottage, and the rising sun turned it into a soft, glowing blanket of white and gold. Seren stood by the open door, watching the world wake up. She had never seen a sunrise from this perspective before. From Cloudhaven, the sunrise was a vast and majestic event, a great flood of color that washed over the entire sky. Here on the ground, it was a more intimate thing. The light did not arrive all at once. It crept over the horizon, first touching the tops of the tallest trees, then slowly, gently, sliding down their trunks and spreading across the land. It was a quiet, gradual revealing of the world. She watched as the light found the small dewdrops on a blade of grass, turning each one into a tiny, fiery jewel. The world was full of these small, hidden beauties, things she could never have seen from her home so high above. Kael was making his final preparations inside the cottage. He moved with a calm and efficient purpose. He was a man of the earth, and he knew what was needed for a long journey on foot. He had a sturdy bag made of thick leather. Into it, he placed a loaf of dark, heavy bread and a block of hard cheese wrapped in a clean cloth. He added a small sack of dried fruit and nuts, food that was light to carry but full of energy. He took a water skin from a hook on the wall and filled it with fresh, cool water from a bucket he had drawn from his well earlier. He checked the edge of a small, sharp knife, its wooden handle worn smooth from years of use. He also packed a small tinderbox with a piece of flint and steel, a tool for making fire. These were the simple, practical tools of survival in his world. They were solid, reliable things made of wood and stone and iron. Seren watched him. Her own preparations had been so different. She had packed a thread of light, a silver needle, and a piece of her cloud home. Her tools were for mending the heavens. His tools were for navigating the earth. She touched the small pouch that hung at her side, feeling the comforting presence of her few possessions. Nimbus, her mist cat, floated near the ceiling, his form a swirl of anxious white vapor. He could feel the change, the tension in the air. Their quiet stay in this small, safe place was over. A long and uncertain road lay ahead of them. Kael finished his packing. He slung the heavy leather bag over his shoulder and picked up a long, smooth walking stick that had been leaning against the wall. He looked at Seren, his expression calm and steady. He gave a single, small nod. It was time to go. They stepped out of the cottage together, and Kael pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind them. The sound of the latch clicking into place felt final. They stood for a moment in the yard, in the soft morning light. Kael took one last look at his home, at his small, neat garden, at the fields where he worked. It was his whole world, this small patch of land. To leave it was a great sacrifice. Seren could see the quiet sadness in his eyes, but she also saw a deep resolve. He was doing this for his home, to protect it from the creeping grayness that threatened to consume it. He turned his back on his farm and looked north, toward the distant, hazy shape of the mountain. That was their goal. That was where the answers were. They began to walk. The path led them away from the farm and into the wilder parts of the land. The first part of their journey was through a forest. For Seren, stepping under the cover of the tall trees was like entering another world. On the open fields, the sky had been a vast and open presence above her. Here, in the forest, the sky disappeared. It was replaced by a high green ceiling of leaves. The sunlight did not pour down in a warm flood. It filtered through the leaves in narrow shafts, creating a shifting, dappled pattern of light and shadow on the forest floor. The air grew cooler, and it smelled of damp earth, of decaying leaves, and of the sharp, clean scent of pine trees. It was a thick, rich air, full of the smells of life and death intertwined. The forest was a place of immense vertical lines. The trunks of the trees were like the great pillars of a cathedral, rising straight and true toward the canopy high above. Seren had never felt so small. She was used to vast, open spaces. The forest was an enclosed space, a world of shadows and hidden things. Her eyes, which were used to scanning the endless horizon of the sky, now had to adjust to looking for a path through the dense undergrowth. She stumbled often on the uneven ground, her feet unused to navigating the tangled network of roots that spread across the path like woody snakes. Kael walked with an easy, confident stride. This was his world. His feet knew the feel of the roots and the stones. He moved through the forest not as a visitor, but as a part of it. He would often hold back a low-hanging branch for her to pass, or offer a steady hand to help her over a fallen log. His silence was a comforting presence, a solid anchor in this strange, new green world. The sounds of the forest were a quiet, constant music, the rustle of their own footsteps on the bed of dry leaves, the soft whisper of the wind in the high branches, the distant, rhythmic tapping of a woodpecker somewhere in the deep woods. Sometimes they would hear a sudden snap of a twig nearby, and Seren would freeze, her heart pounding. Kael would simply pause, listen for a moment, and then continue walking, his calm demeanor reassuring her that there was no danger. Once, a large deer with magnificent antlers stepped onto the path ahead of them. It stopped and looked at them with its large, dark, liquid eyes. Seren held her breath. It was a creature of such grace and quiet beauty. The deer watched them for a long moment, its ears twitching, and then it turned and bounded away, disappearing into the trees with a few effortless leaps. Nimbus, who had been a tense ball of mist on her shoulder, seemed to relax a little after the deer was gone. The solid, living creatures of this world were a source of endless fascination and a little bit of fear for both of them. For Kael, the journey was a different kind of discovery. He was seeing his familiar world through her eyes. He had walked this forest path 100 times, but he had never really noticed the way the light fell through the leaves. He had never stopped to marvel at the intricate patterns of moss growing on the side of an old stone. Seren would often stop and gently touch the bark of a tree, her expression one of wonder. She would run her fingers over the soft, velvety surface of the moss, or pick up a fallen feather and study its delicate structure. He saw her quiet joy in these small things, and it made him see them in a new way. He started to notice the different kinds of birdsong, the subtle variations in the color of the leaves. His world, which had always been a practical place of work and survival, was now revealing its hidden layers of beauty. He also learned from her. One afternoon, as they rested, she pointed up at a small patch of blue sky that was visible through a gap in the canopy. She then took a single, shimmering thread of sunbeam from her pouch. She held it up, and in her hands it seemed to glow with a life of its own. She showed him how the thread was made of pure light, how it was both weightless and incredibly strong. She could not explain it with words, but he understood. The sky was not empty space. It was a thing that was woven, a delicate and powerful creation. He looked up at the patch of blue with a new respect. It was not just a color, it was a fabric. And this quiet, gentle woman was its caretaker. He also watched her mist cat, Nimbus. The creature was a constant mystery. Sometimes, when they came to a fork in the path, Nimbus would drift ahead down one of the paths, and then pulse with a faint, soft light. Kael learned to trust this sign. The mist cat seemed to have a sense for the right way, for the safest path. It was another kind of knowledge, not of the earth, but of the air and the subtle flows of energy that he could not see. After 2 days of walking through the forest, the trees began to thin, and the sound of rushing water grew louder. They came to the edge of the woods and saw a wide, fast-flowing river. The water was clear and sparkling, tumbling over smooth gray stones. For Seren, it was another marvel. She had only ever seen water as a still, flat blue shape from above, or as the gentle morning dew she collected. She had never seen water that was alive, that moved with such power and purpose. She walked to the edge and knelt down, putting her hand into the current. The cold was a shock, a clean and sharp feeling. The force of the water pushed against her hand, a constant living pressure. She could see small silver fish darting through the clear water, their bodies flashing in the sun. They needed to cross the river. It was too deep and fast to walk through. Kael led them upstream, along the riverbank. He was looking for a place to cross. After a while, he found what he was looking for. A huge, ancient tree had fallen across the river, its massive trunk forming a natural bridge to the other side. The bark was worn smooth by the weather, and it was covered in slippery green moss in some places. It looked dangerous to Seren. But Kael stepped onto the log with confidence. He walked a few steps and then turned, holding out his hand to her. She hesitated. To walk on this narrow, slippery log with the rushing water below was a terrifying prospect. But she looked at his outstretched hand, at his calm and steady face. She trusted him. She took his hand, and he led her slowly and carefully across the log. His grip was firm and reassuring. When they reached the other side, her legs were trembling, but she was filled with a sense of accomplishment. She had faced a fear and overcome it with his help. They were learning to rely on each other, to combine his knowledge of the earth with her courage. They continued their journey on the other side of the river. The land here was more open, a landscape of rolling green hills. They walked for another day under the wide open sky. Seren felt more comfortable here, with the great blue dome above her. At night, they would make a small camp. Kael would gather dry wood, and, with his flint and steel, he would create a small, cheerful fire. The first time Seren saw him make fire, it was like watching magic. A single spark, born from the clash of stone and steel, grew into a dancing flame that provided warmth and light and kept the deep darkness of the night at bay. They would sit by the fire, eating their simple meal of bread and cheese. They rarely spoke. There were not many words they shared, but the silence between them was comfortable, a shared space of quiet understanding. Seren would look up at the stars. From the ground, the stars looked different. They were brighter, sharper, and they seemed to flicker and dance. She felt a pang of longing for her work, for the gentle task of stitching the stars into place. But she knew her work was here now, on this ground, under these same stars. It was on the fourth day of their journey that they began to feel the change again. It was the same cold, creeping stillness they had felt before. The air grew heavy. The birdsong faded. The vibrant green of the hills began to dull, taking on a grayish tinge. They were entering the lands of the gray sickness once more, but this time they were much deeper into its territory. The forgotten mountain was closer now, a dark and jagged shape that dominated the northern horizon. The source of the sickness was drawing near. Soon, they saw the village. It was nestled in a small valley, and from a distance, it looked like a cluster of gray stones in a gray landscape. As they got closer, the full extent of the decay became clear. This village was not just touched by the sickness, it was almost completely consumed by it. The houses were in a terrible state of disrepair. Roofs had collapsed, and windows were dark, empty holes. The gardens were filled with the dead, brittle stalks of withered plants. A fine gray dust seemed to cover everything, lying thick on the cobblestone streets and the wooden windowsills. There was no wind. The air was stagnant and smelled faintly of dust and decay. The people of the village were like ghosts. A few of them were moving slowly through the streets, their shoulders slumped, their feet shuffling in the dust. Their faces were pale and gaunt, and their eyes were dull and empty, as if the light inside them had been extinguished. They did not look at Seren and Kael as they entered the village. It was as if they did not have the energy to be curious or afraid. They were simply existing, trapped in a slow, gray dream of despair. A blacksmith's workshop stood silent, the fire in its forge long dead, the tools on the bench covered in a layer of rust and dust. The village well stood in the center of a small square. The stone around it was dark and damp, but the water in the bucket beside it was cloudy and still. Even the water seemed to be sick. Seren felt a wave of profound sadness wash over her. The unraveling of the sky was not an abstract problem. This was the result. This silent, dying village. This was the human cost of the sickness. She felt the sky above her. It was thin here, dangerously thin. It felt like a worn-out, threadbare piece of cloth that could tear completely at any moment. The light from the sun was weak and cold, offering no comfort. Kael walked beside her, his face a mask of grim determination. He looked at the faces of the villagers, and his hand tightened its grip on his walking stick. This was what they were fighting. Not just a strange grayness on the land, but a deep, soul-crushing despair. They walked through the village to the other side. They had planned to just pass through, to continue on their way to the mountain. But as they were leaving the last of the houses behind, Seren stopped. She could not just leave. She could not walk away from this place and do nothing. It was not in her nature. She was a mender. She saw what was broken, and her entire being was dedicated to making it whole again. She knew she could not cure the gray sickness here. She could not reweave the entire sky. But she could make one small repair. She could create one small point of light in this overwhelming gloom. She could give these people a single spark of hope. She turned to Kael and pointed to the village well. Then she held up her hands, making a small weaving motion with her fingers. He understood immediately what she wanted to do. He looked back at the village, at the hopeless, shuffling figures. He knew that a small act of hope could be a powerful thing in a place like this. He nodded, his eyes telling her that he would support her. He walked back toward the village square with her. He stood near her, his hand resting on his walking stick, a silent guardian. He would keep watch while she did her work. Seren sat on the dusty ground near the well. She opened her small leather pouch and took out her spool of sunbeam thread. Even in the dim gray light of the village, the thread glowed with a soft internal warmth. It was a tiny piece of a healthy, vibrant sun, a stark contrast to the sick world around it. She did not have her loom. The great and ancient loom was far away in her cottage on Cloudhaven. But she was a weaver. Her skill was not in the tool, but in her hands and in her heart. She looked around and found a small forked branch that had fallen from a dead tree. It was a poor substitute for her silver inlaid loom, but it would have to do. She carefully wound the sunbeam thread around the two prongs of the forked branch, creating a small rectangular frame of glowing warp threads. Then she began to weave. She used her silver needle as a shuttle, passing it back and forth, over and under the warp threads. Her hands moved with a focused grace, her fingers dancing in the dim light. In this place of silence and despair, her small act of creation was a powerful statement of defiance. She was not weaving a simple patch. She was weaving a prayer. She poured all of her hope, all of her longing for beauty and wholeness into each thread. A small square patch of pure concentrated sunlight began to grow on her makeshift loom. It was so bright, it seemed to push back the grayness around her. It was a tiny sun in the palm of her hand. When the patch was finished, she carefully cut it free. It floated in her hand for a moment, a perfect square of woven light, warm to the touch. Now she had to get it into place. She looked up at the thin, weak sky directly above the well. There was a place there that was particularly threadbare, almost transparent. That was her target. She took the end of her sunbeam thread and, with a flick of her wrist, she cast it upwards. It was a motion she had used 1,000 times to secure the stars in the night sky. The thread flew up, straight and true, carrying the small glowing patch with it. The patch rose higher and higher, a tiny golden star ascending into the gray heavens. It reached the weak spot in the sky and settled into place. There was a soft, silent flash of golden light. The patch merged with the fabric of the sky, becoming one with it. And then it happened. A single, perfect, brilliant beam of pure, warm sunlight lanced down from the heavens. It cut through the gray, stagnant air like a golden sword. It struck the stone of the village well, and the dull, damp stone suddenly glittered as if it were studded with diamonds. The beam of light was a solid pillar of warmth and color in the middle of the gray, dying village. For a long moment, nothing happened. The few people in the streets had stopped their slow shuffling to watch her strange work. Now, they just stared at the beam of light, their faces blank, as if they could not comprehend what they were seeing. Then, a small child, the one she had seen earlier holding the dead flower, took a hesitant step forward. He walked slowly toward the pillar of light, his eyes wide. He reached out a small, pale hand and put it into the sunbeam. A look of pure wonder spread across his face. He laughed, a small, quiet sound that was shocking in the deep silence of the village. It was the first sound of joy this place had heard in a very long time. His laugh broke the spell. An old woman who had been sitting hunched on her doorstep slowly got to her feet and shuffled toward the well. She reached the light and simply stood in it, turning her face up to the warmth, tears streaming silently down her wrinkled cheeks. One by one, the people of the village began to emerge from their gray houses. They were drawn to the light, to the warmth, to the small miracle in the center of their square. They gathered around the well, not speaking, not touching, just standing in the golden glow. They looked up at the small, perfect circle of blue sky that had opened up above them, a window into a world they had almost forgotten. A mother held her child up, letting the warm light touch his face. An old man reached out and touched the glittering, sun-drenched water in the well bucket. It was not a cure. The grayness still pressed in on all sides of the village. The fields were still dead. But it was a start. It was a spark. It was a single, defiant candle lit in a great and overwhelming darkness. It was hope. Seren watched them, her heart full. This was why she had come. This was the true meaning of her work. Kael stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. His face was filled with a deep, quiet emotion. He looked at the villagers, and he looked at Seren, and he knew that he was in the presence of something truly special. They had given these people a gift more precious than food or water. They had given them a reason to look up again. Their work here was done. Silently, they turned and walked away from the village. They did not look back. They did not need to. They could feel the small point of light behind them, a beacon of hope in the gray land. The journey ahead was still long and dangerous. The mountain still loomed on the horizon, a dark and threatening presence. But now, they walked with a renewed sense of purpose. They had seen the true face of the sickness, and they had seen that it was not invincible. They had proven that even the smallest thread of light could make a difference. Their bond, which had been forged in quiet companionship, was now sealed in a shared act of healing. They were no longer just a weaver and a farmer. They were partners, united in a single, vital quest. They walked on, side by side, their steps more certain now, their hearts filled with a fragile but persistent hope. Chapter 5. The Keeper of the Mountain. The single beam of light they had left behind in the village did not follow them. As Seren and Kael walked northward, the familiar, oppressive grayness closed in around them once more. But something had changed inside them. The light was gone from their sight, but it remained in their hearts, a small, warm coal of hope. They had seen the despair, but they had also seen that despair could be broken. They walked with a new strength, a shared purpose that needed no words. The dark and distant mountain no longer seemed like just a destination of dread. It was now a place of answers, the location of the lock for which they were beginning to believe they might find a key. The land continued to grow sicker as they traveled. The thin grass gave way to barren, dusty soil that was cracked and dry, like the bottom of a dried-up lake. The gray dust they had seen in the village was thicker here, a fine, gritty powder that coated everything. It puffed up in small clouds around their feet with every step, and they could feel its abrasive texture in their throats. The dead trees were more numerous now, and they were no longer just lifeless skeletons. They were twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches contorted as if they had died in terrible pain. The bark was peeled away, revealing pale, diseased wood underneath. A strange, pale fungus grew in patches on the contorted trunks, a life form that seemed to thrive on the decay. The silence was also deeper, more profound. In the village, there had been the faint shuffling sounds of the people. Here, there was nothing. No wind, no insects, no birds, not even the sound of their own footsteps, which were muffled by the thick layer of dust. The silence was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound and made the world feel unreal, like a dream from which they could not wake. Seren felt the sickness more acutely with every step they took toward the mountain. Her connection to the sky was a part of her, as real as her own heartbeat. Here, that connection was a source of constant, low-level pain. The sky above was so thin, so fragile, that it felt like a torn piece of silk. She could feel the loose threads, the weak spots, the places where the fabric of light was about to give way completely. It manifested as a dull ache behind her eyes, a constant pressure that made it hard to focus. She felt weak and drained, as if her own energy was being slowly siphoned away by the sick land and the failing sky. Nimbus was a small, tight knot of mist on her shoulder, his form so condensed he was barely recognizable as a cat. He did not move. He did not float. He was just a silent, cold weight, a small piece of the sky that was suffering along with the rest of this wounded world. Kael felt the sickness in a different way. He was a man of the earth, and the earth here was screaming. He could feel it through the soles of his worn leather boots. The ground was not just dead, it was wrong. It felt hollow, brittle, and corrupt. There was no life in it, no strength, no potential for growth. It was a violation of everything he understood about the world. As a farmer, he knew the feeling of good soil, the rich, dark earth that was full of life and promise. This dust was its opposite. It was the ash of a dead world. He walked with his jaw clenched, his hand gripping his walking stick so tightly that his knuckles were white. This was a deep and personal insult to his world, and his quiet sadness was slowly being forged into a hard, cold anger. He would look at Seren, see the pain in her eyes, and his resolve would harden. He had to be strong for both of them. He had to be her anchor in this dead, gray sea. They walked for what felt like days, though it was impossible to tell time in the unchanging dim light. The sun was a pale, useless disk in the sky, its position the only marker of the passing hours. They ate their simple food, the bread and cheese tasting like dust in their mouths. They drank their water, which seemed to lose its coolness the moment it left the water skin. They slept in short, restless bursts, huddled together for warmth against the deep, unnatural chill of the land. They were pushing their bodies and their spirits to their limits, driven forward only by the dark shape of the mountain that grew ever larger before them. They finally arrived at the base of the mountain. It was even more intimidating up close. It was a jagged mass of black rock that clawed at the weak sky. Great piles of broken stone lay at its base, the result of ancient rock slides. There were no gentle slopes here, no foothills to ease the transition from the flat land to the steep climb. The mountain simply erupted from the ground, a sheer and hostile wall of rock. The gray sickness was at its most powerful here. The air was thick and heavy, making each breath a conscious effort. The dust on the ground was so deep, it was like walking through fine gray sand. The silence was absolute, a void that seemed to pull all energy into it. Standing at the foot of this dead mountain, in the heart of the sickness, a wave of pure despair washed over Seren. It was too much. The mountain was too big. The sickness was too strong, and she was too small, too weak. She felt her knees begin to buckle, her will to go on finally dissolving into the overwhelming grayness. Just as she was about to fall, Kael grabbed her arm, his grip firm and steady. He looked into her eyes, and in their depths she saw not despair, but a fierce, burning light. He did not let her fall. He held her up, and then he pointed. His finger was aimed at a place a little way up the slope. Seren followed his gaze. She saw nothing at first, just the endless, monotonous black rock and gray dust. But then she saw it, a single tiny point of green. It was a small plant, no bigger than her hand, growing out of a crack in a large boulder. It was an impossible sight. In this land where everything was dead or dying, this one small plant was vibrantly, defiantly alive. Its leaves were a deep and healthy green. Hope, which had been all but extinguished, flared up again inside her. That small patch of green was a sign. It was a promise that life had not been completely vanquished from this place. Kael started to walk toward the plant, his steps slow but purposeful, still holding her arm to support her. As they got closer, they saw more signs of life. A thin, clear trickle of water was running down the rock face near the plant, the water sparkling in the dim light. Where the water touched the ground, a small patch of green moss was growing, soft and velvety. It was a tiny oasis of life in an immense desert of decay. It was as if a small pocket of the world had been protected, had resisted the encroaching sickness. They followed the trickle of water upwards. It led them along a narrow, almost invisible path that wound its way between the great black boulders. The air grew cleaner with every step. The thick, choking dust began to thin, and they could breathe more easily. A faint, clean scent of damp earth and growing things replaced the smell of decay. The oppressive silence was broken by the gentle, musical sound of the trickling water. They had found a hidden sanctuary, a small vein of life that was still beating in the heart of the dead mountain. The path led them into a small, sheltered hollow, a natural amphitheater carved into the side of the mountain. And there, nestled against the rock wall, was a small, low hut. It did not look like Kael's cottage, which was made of cut wood and stone. This hut seemed to have grown out of the mountain itself. Its walls were made of unshaped river stones, covered in a thick blanket of living green moss. The roof was made of thick, overlapping pieces of slate, the same black rock as the mountain. A thin curl of clean, white smoke rose from a small stone chimney, a silent testament to the life within. In front of the hut was a small, thriving garden, filled with green herbs and colorful flowers, an impossible explosion of life and color in this gray world. As they stood there, staring at this miracle, the door of the hut opened. It was a simple, round door made of a single slab of dark, polished wood. An old woman stood in the doorway. She was not tall, but she stood with a straight-backed dignity that made her seem larger than she was. Her face was a network of deep wrinkles, a map of 1,000 years of sun and wind. Her hair was long and pure white, braided into a single thick plait that hung down her back. But it was her eyes that held Seren's gaze. They were a pale, clear gray, the color of a dawn sky, and they were filled with a deep and ancient wisdom. They were eyes that had seen the birth of mountains and the slow turning of stars. She was not surprised to see them. There was no fear, no curiosity in her expression. It was a look of calm, quiet expectation, as if she had been waiting for them for a very long time. She did not speak. She simply raised one hand and beckoned them inside. Seren and Kael walked slowly toward the hut, feeling as though they were stepping onto sacred ground. They passed through the round doorway and into the single circular room within. The inside of the hut was simple and clean. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something else, a clean, earthy scent like fresh rain on dry soil. A small, bright fire burned in a stone hearth, its flames dancing cheerfully, casting a warm, flickering light on the curved stone walls. Bunches of dried herbs and flowers hung from the low wooden beams of the ceiling. A low bed covered in simple woven blankets stood against one wall. A large flat stone served as a table in the center of the room. It was a place of deep peace, a perfect opposite to the sick, chaotic world just outside its walls. The old woman gestured for them to sit on low, three-legged stools near the fire. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her bare feet making no sound on the smooth stone floor. She went to a large clay pot that stood in a corner and ladled out 2 cups of clear water. She handed one to Seren and one to Kael. They took the cups with trembling hands. The water was cool and sweet, the purest, cleanest water Seren had ever tasted. As she drank, she felt the dust and grit being washed from her throat. But it was more than that. She felt a clean, healing energy spreading through her body, washing away the weariness of their long journey and the dull ache of the sickness. It was like drinking pure life. Kael drained his cup in one long drink, and when he lowered it, some of the hard, angry tension had gone from his face. The old woman sat down on a stool opposite them. She looked at them for a long moment, her wise gray eyes moving from Seren to Kael and back again. She saw the dust on their clothes, the exhaustion in their bodies. She saw the pouch at Seren's side, from which a faint golden light was pulsing. She saw the calloused hands and the fierce determination of the young man of the earth. She saw their shared purpose, the invisible bond that had been forged between them on their journey. She knew who they were, and she knew why they had come. She leaned forward and pointed a long, wrinkled finger at the fire in the hearth. She made a gentle, beckoning gesture, inviting them to look into the flames. Seren and Kael turned their gaze from the woman to the fire. As they watched, the simple dancing flames began to change. The colors shifted and swirled, and images began to form in the heart of the fire. It was not a normal fire. It was a fire of seeing, a fire of knowledge. The first image they saw was a vision of the beginning of the world. It was a swirling chaos of light and shadow, of fire and stone. Then, two great forces began to emerge from the chaos. One was a brilliant weaving light, a force of creation that spun and twisted, forming the great empty dome of the sky. Seren gasped. She recognized the pattern. It was the great weaving, the ancient and fundamental structure of the heavens, a pattern she knew from the deepest parts of her being. The other force was a solid, slow, powerful energy that rose up from the chaos, hardening and shaping itself into the land, the mountains, the rocks, the soil. It was the earth. The flames shifted again. The vision showed them the two great forces, the sky and the earth, coming together. They did not just touch, they wove themselves into each other. Threads of light from the sky reached down and wrapped themselves around the peaks of the mountains. The strength of the stone rose up to meet them, anchoring the delicate fabric of the heavens to the solid foundation of the world. It was a dance of creation, a perfect harmony between the two forces. Seren saw that the sky was not separate from the land. They were two parts of a single, magnificent creation, each one giving the other strength and purpose. The vision in the fire then focused on the very mountain where they now sat. At its highest peak, the vision showed the final act of the weaving. All the threads of light and all the lines of earthly power came together in one place. They twisted and knotted around each other, and in a brilliant flash of light, they formed a great, magnificent crystal. The crystal pulsed with a soft, warm light, a steady, powerful heartbeat. It was the knot that held the entire weaving of the world together. The sky anchor. From the anchor, a constant flow of good, clean energy radiated outwards, filling the sky with light and color and filling the land with life and vitality. The vision in the flames then began to move forward in time. Centuries passed in a few moments. The crystal, the sky anchor, remained strong and bright. But then, a subtle change occurred. A tiny, almost invisible crack appeared on its surface. It was a small flaw, a minor imperfection. But over more long years, the crack slowly, imperceptibly, began to widen. The vision showed the great storm they had recently experienced. The massive bolt of lightning did not just tear the sky, it struck the mountain peak. The vision showed the lightning hitting the sky anchor, and the tiny crack suddenly split, running deep into the heart of the crystal. Now, the final, terrible image appeared in the flames. The sky anchor was no longer radiating life. It was doing the opposite. The crack had broken the harmony. Instead of being a source of energy, the anchor had become a drain. The vision showed the light and color being pulled from the sky, funneled down into the crack in the crystal. It showed the life force being sucked up from the soil, from the plants, from the very water, drawn into the flawed anchor. A thin gray vapor, like a puff of smoke, leaked from the crack. It was the gray sickness. The vision showed the gray smoke pooling at the base of the mountain and then slowly, relentlessly, spreading outwards across the land, a tide of decay and despair. The fire then returned to normal, its simple, dancing flames casting a warm light on the three silent figures. The vision was gone, but the understanding it brought was complete and devastating. Seren finally understood the true nature of the problem. It was not just a tear, not just an unraveling. The very heart of the world was broken. The sky anchor, The thing that was meant to join the sky and the land in harmony was now poisoning them both. Kael also understood. The sickness was not a curse from some outside force. It was a wound, a deep internal wound in the land he loved. The harmony had been broken, and the world was slowly bleeding out its life. The old woman watched their faces. She saw that they understood. She did not need to speak a single word. She then turned her attention to Seren. She pointed to the small pouch at Seren's side, the one that held her sunbeam thread. Seren, understanding, took out the small, glowing spool. She held it in the palm of her hand. The old woman looked at the thread, and she gave a small, slow shake of her head. It was a beautiful thread, a powerful thread of pure light. But it was not enough. The old woman then pointed to the sky. Then she pointed to Seren's thread, a thread of the sky. Then she pointed down to the stone floor of her hut, to the earth itself. Then she looked at Kael, at his sturdy leather boots, at his strong, calloused hands, a thread of the earth. Finally, the old woman held up her own two hands and slowly, deliberately, twisted them together, interlocking her fingers. The message was perfectly clear. To mend a wound that affected both the sky and the land, they needed a thread that was made of both. A thread of sky and earth woven together. The puzzle was now complete. They knew the problem, and they knew the solution. But the path to that solution was still long and dangerous. The old woman seemed to read their thoughts. She stood up and went to the flat stone table. With one long, wrinkled finger, she cleared the fine layer of dust from its surface. Then, using that same finger, she began to draw in the dust. She drew the shape of the mountain peak. Then, she drew a long, winding, treacherous path that led up to it. She drew symbols along the path. She drew a swirl of lines, indicating a place of powerful, unpredictable winds that could tear a person from the mountainside. She drew a cluster of small, falling rocks, indicating a place where the mountain was unstable and prone to rock slides. She was giving them a map, a guide to the dangers of the climb. She was showing them the way. When she was finished, she looked at them one last time. She reached into a small pouch she wore at her own belt and took out a single, small object. It was a stone, a perfectly smooth, flat, gray stone that had been worn down by a river over thousands of years. It was cool to the touch. She pressed the stone into Kael's hand. It was a simple, silent gift, a blessing, a small piece of the mountain's true, healthy spirit to protect them on their journey into its sick heart. She then walked to the round door and opened it, holding it for them. Their time in her sanctuary was over. It was time for them to face the mountain. Seren and Kael rose to their feet. They looked at the old woman, the keeper of the mountain, and bowed their heads in a gesture of deep gratitude. She had given them knowledge, she had given them a solution, and she had given them a path. She had given them back their hope. They walked out of the hut, stepping from the warm, living air of her small sanctuary back into the cold, gray gloom of the mountainside. The keeper watched them go, her face calm and unreadable. As they set foot on the first steep, dusty slope of the mountain, the round door of the hut closed silently behind them, and the small sanctuary of life disappeared once more, as if it had never been there at all. They were alone again, but they were no longer lost. They had a purpose. They had a plan. The great and perilous climb had begun. Chapter 6. The Climb to the Peak. The first part of the climb was a slow and grueling struggle. The base of the mountain was a vast, chaotic jumble of loose rock and steep slopes of gray dust. There was no clear path. The map the old woman had drawn in the dust was a guide to the dangers higher up. But here, at the bottom, they had to find their own way. Every step was an effort. The dust was fine and deep, and their feet sank into it with each movement, making it feel like they were walking through thick, heavy sand. With every step, a small cloud of the gray powder would rise, filling the air, making their throats dry and their eyes sting. The rocks were sharp and unstable. They would often shift and slide under their weight, forcing them to scramble for balance to avoid a fall. The world was a monotonous landscape of gray dust and black rock with no sign of life, no color, no sound. Seren found the physical effort of the climb to be a profound and exhausting challenge. Her life on Cloudhaven had been one of gentle, graceful movements, of weaving with weightless threads of light. She had never known this kind of deep, aching muscle fatigue. Her legs burned with a fire she had never felt before. Her lungs struggled to draw breath from the thin, heavy air. The solid ground, which had been a source of wonder when she first arrived, was now a harsh and unforgiving enemy. It was a world of sharp edges and brutal gravity. She would often slip, her soft hands scraping against the rough surface of the rocks, leaving behind small streaks of red. The pain was a new and startling sensation. Her world had been one without pain, without this kind of physical struggle. Kael was the strong, silent heart of their ascent. He was a man of the earth, and though this land was sick, he understood its language. He moved with a slow, deliberate patience, his walking stick testing the stability of the ground before he put his full weight on it. His eyes, accustomed to reading the subtle signs of the land, scanned the slopes ahead, looking for the safest route, the most stable line through the chaos of fallen rock. He was her physical support. When she stumbled, his strong hand was there to catch her. When they came to a steep section of loose dust that offered no firm footing, he would go first, kicking his boots into the slope to create small, temporary steps for her to follow. He would place his body between her and the steep drop below, a living shield against the mountain's dangers. He did not speak. He did not need to. His steady presence, his unwavering support, was a constant source of strength for her. He was an anchor of solid earth in this unstable, shifting world. Her own skills, however, were not useless. Though her body was weak, her senses were attuned to the sky in a way that Kael's were not. As they climbed higher, the gray mist that clung to the mountain grew thicker. It was a cold, clammy fog that limited their vision to only a few feet in front of them. They were climbing blind, surrounded by a disorienting white-gray void. Kael, who relied on his sight to navigate, was at a disadvantage. But Seren could feel the air. She could sense the subtle currents and densities in the mist. She could feel the places where the sky above was a little thinner, where the sickness was a little less concentrated. She would close her eyes and a faint internal map of the air would form in her mind. She would gently touch Kael's arm and point in a direction that looked no different from any other. He learned to trust her guidance implicitly. She would lead them to small pockets of clearer air, tiny temporary clearings in the thick fog where they could catch their breath and see the path ahead for a few precious moments. She led them away from areas where the air felt stagnant and heavy, places where the sickness was so thick it felt like it could suffocate them. Her knowledge of the sky was guiding their path on the land. Nimbus also played a vital role. The mist cat, which had been a small, inert ball on her shoulder, seemed to awaken as they entered the thicker mist. He would float from her shoulder and drift a few feet ahead of them, a small white shape in the gray fog. He was made of the same substance as the mist, but he was a living, sentient part of it. He could sense the dangers they could not see. He would stop and hover, his form pulsing with a faint, cool light. When he detected an unstable ledge or a patch of loose rocks hidden by the fog, he would drift to the left or the right, silently showing them the safest way forward. He was their scout, their silent, ethereal guide through the blinding mist. They worked as a team, a perfect fusion of their two worlds. Kael provided the strength, the physical endurance, the knowledge of the solid ground. Seren and Nimbus provided the senses, the perception of the unseen, the knowledge of the air and the sky. They were two halves of a single climber, and together they were able to overcome the challenges of the lower slopes. They helped each other, they supported each other, they trusted each other completely. Their shared struggle forged their bond into something unbreakable. After what felt like an eternity, the terrain began to change. The steep slopes of loose dust gave way to more solid rock. They were climbing a series of narrow, winding ledges that crisscrossed the face of a sheer cliff. This was the part of the mountain the old woman had warned them about, the place of unpredictable winds. The mist was thinner here, but the new danger was far more terrifying. The wind did not blow in a steady stream. It came in sudden, violent gusts, howling out of the gray emptiness with no warning. One moment, the air would be perfectly still. The next, a furious blast of wind would slam into them, threatening to tear them from their precarious footing and hurl them into the abyss below. They had to flatten themselves against the cold, hard rock face with each gust, their fingers clinging to any small crack or handhold they could find. The wind was a physical force, a giant, invisible hand trying to push them off the mountain. It shrieked in their ears, a high, mournful sound like the cry of a tormented spirit. Seren had never imagined a wind like this. The breezes on Cloudhaven were gentle and playful. This wind was a monster. It was a raw, untamed force of nature, full of anger and chaos. It was the sick breath of the wounded mountain. Kael went first, his body a solid shield against the worst of the wind. He would find a secure handhold and then reach back for her, guiding her hand to a safe place. They moved with agonizing slowness, inching their way along the narrow ledge, a few feet at a time. The drop below them was lost in the gray mist, a terrifying, bottomless emptiness. During one particularly violent gust, Seren's foot slipped. The loose gravel on the ledge gave way, and for a terrifying second, she was dangling over the abyss, her only connection to the mountain, her desperate grip on a small outcrop of rock. Panic, cold, and absolute seized her. Her fingers started to lose their grip. She was going to fall. But then, Kael's hand closed around her wrist. His grip was like a band of iron. He did not say a word. He just held on, his muscles straining, his feet braced against the rock. He held her. He was her anchor. Slowly, with immense effort, he pulled her back up onto the safety of the ledge. She collapsed against the rock face, her body trembling, her heart hammering against her ribs. He stood over her, his body shielding her from the wind until her trembling subsided. He had saved her life. In that moment, the bond between them went beyond partnership, beyond friendship. It became something deeper, something elemental. He was the earth that held her. She was the light that guided him. They finally made it past the windy ledges and onto a wider, more stable section of the mountain. They collapsed onto the ground, utterly exhausted, their bodies bruised and aching, their spirits battered by the constant tension and fear. They rested for a long time, huddled together in the shelter of a large boulder, sharing the last of their bread and water. They were higher now. The air was thinner and colder. The gray mist swirled around them, sometimes parting to give them a brief, dizzying glimpse of the dead, gray world far below. They were in a different world now, a world of rock and cloud and silence, a world between the land they had left and the sky they were trying to heal. As they rested, Seren felt a new and growing pain. It was a sharp, stabbing ache in her chest. It was the unraveling of the sky. They were so close to the peak, so close to the broken sky anchor, that she could feel its sickness as a direct, physical assault on her very being. The fabric of the heavens was so thin here it was almost non-existent. She felt naked, exposed. The protective blanket she had tended her whole life was gone, and she could feel the cold, empty void beyond. It was a terrible, soul-crushing feeling. She leaned against Kael, her strength failing her. He put his arm around her, sharing his warmth, his solid presence a comfort against the deep, existential cold she was feeling. The next stage of the climb brought the danger the old woman had represented with the symbol of falling rocks. They had to cross a long, steep slope of broken scree, a massive field of loose, sharp-edged stones. This was a place where the mountain was actively falling apart. The ground was treacherous and unstable. Every step sent a shower of small rocks skittering down the slope. And from above, larger rocks would periodically break loose from the cliffs and come crashing down, bouncing and tumbling with terrifying speed. They had to be constantly vigilant, their heads tilted upwards, listening for the telltale clatter of a falling stone. Several times they had to scramble for cover, pressing themselves into a shallow depression or behind a larger boulder as a rock the size of a man's head came bounding down the slope, missing them by only a few feet. It was a deadly game of chance. The mountain itself seemed to be trying to kill them, to shake them from its back like persistent insects. Nimbus was invaluable here. His misty form was immune to the falling rocks, and he could drift higher up the slope. He would pulse with a bright, urgent light just before a rockfall began, giving them a precious few seconds of warning to find shelter. He was their early warning system, their silent, floating sentinel. They were in a state of constant, heightened alert. Every muscle was tense, every nerve on edge. The strain was immense. Seren was growing weaker. The pain in her chest was a constant agony, and the physical effort of the climb was draining the last of her reserves. She was moving on pure will now, her body screaming for her to stop. Kael saw her fading strength. He saw the pain etched on her face. He knew she could not go on like this for much longer. He took the leather bag from his own shoulders and gently put it on hers. It was almost empty, a small weight. Then he did something that stunned her. He knelt down in front of her, his back to her. It was a clear, silent invitation. He would carry her. Seren hesitated, but she looked at the long, dangerous slope still ahead of them, and she looked at the unwavering strength in his eyes. She knew he was right. She could not make it on her own. With the last of her strength, she climbed onto his back, her arms looping around his neck. He stood up, his legs straining under the new weight, and began to climb. He carried her. He carried her hope, her skill, her purpose, on his own strong back. He moved with a slow, steady rhythm, his every step a testament to his incredible strength and his absolute devotion to their quest. Seren rested her head against his shoulder, the pain in her chest a little easier to bear now that she was not fighting the mountain with every step. She closed her eyes and focused all her remaining energy on one thing, sensing the sky, listening for the whispers of the wind, watching for the warnings from Nimbus. She would be his eyes and ears. He would be her legs and her strength. They climbed as one. The final part of the ascent was the steepest and most difficult of all. It was a near vertical climb up a jagged ridge of black, ice-slicked rock. The peak was so close now, they could feel its wrongness, its cold, draining power. The air was thin and bitingly cold. Small, sharp crystals of ice coated the rocks, making every handhold and foothold treacherous. They were high above the mist now, in a world of stark black rock and pale, thin sky. They could see for miles in every direction, a vast panorama of the dead, gray lands. The world looked like a corpse from up here. Kael climbed with a grim, focused determination, his fingers raw and bleeding from the sharp rock and ice. He found strength he did not know he possessed. He was fueled by his anger at the sickness, by his love for the dying world below, and by the precious weight of the woman on his back. He climbed for her. Seren, for her part, had entered a state of deep concentration. The pain in her chest was a roaring fire now, but she pushed it aside. She focused on the flow of the air, on the feel of the sky. She could feel the brokenness of the sky anchor above them, a discordant note in the symphony of the world. It was a beacon, a terrible, painful beacon that was guiding them to the source. Finally, with one last agonizing push, Kael pulled himself up over the final ledge. He had made it. He stood on the small, flat summit of the forgotten mountain. He gently let Seren slide from his back onto the ground. They had arrived at the peak. They were at the heart of the wound. Chapter 7. Weaving a New Bond. The summit of the forgotten mountain was a desolate and lonely place. It was not a sharp, pointed peak, but a small, flat plateau of black rock, scoured clean by centuries of relentless wind. The ground was uneven and cracked, and a thin, sharp layer of ice clung to the stones in the shaded places, glittering faintly in the pale, weak light. The air was painfully thin and bitingly cold. Every breath was a conscious effort, a sharp intake of cold that seemed to burn the lungs. The silence was absolute, a deep and profound emptiness that was different from the dead silence of the lands below. This was the silence of the top of the world, a place far removed from the sounds of life, a place that felt close to the cold, empty void of the stars. They stood on the edge of the plateau, looking out over the vast expanse of the sick world. From this great height, they could see the full extent of the gray sickness. It stretched for miles in every direction, a great, colorless stain on the body of the world. The distant forests were hazy gray smudges, the rivers were dull silver lines, and the fields were patches of indistinct brown. The world looked like a faded memory, a beautiful painting that had been left out in the rain until all its colors had run together into a single sad shade of gray. Kael stood tall, his legs braced against the wind, his hand still resting protectively on Seren's shoulder. The climb was over, but the exhaustion was a heavy weight in his bones. His body ached with a deep, profound weariness. His hands were raw and bleeding, his muscles were screaming in protest, but he stood firm. This was the source, this was the enemy. He looked out at the blighted landscape, and a cold, hard anger settled in his heart. This was his world, his home, and it had been wounded so deeply. He felt a fierce, protective surge of energy. He would not let it die. Seren stood beside him, her body trembling, not just from the cold, but from the raw, overwhelming power of the sickness that saturated this place. The dull ache in her chest had become a sharp, unbearable agony. It felt as if a shard of ice was lodged in her heart. Being this close to the source of the unraveling was a physical torture. The sky above them was a pale, almost white sheet, so thin and fragile it looked like it could shred and blow away in the next gust of wind. She could feel the broken threads, the gaping holes in the weave of the heavens. It was a chaotic, painful symphony of broken notes in her soul. They turned their gaze from the horizon to the center of the plateau. There it was, the sky anchor. It was a massive crystal, as tall as 3 men standing on each other's shoulders. It was not a clear, perfect crystal. Its surface was a milky, semi-translucent white, and it seemed to absorb the weak light rather than reflect it. It rose from the black rock of the summit as if it had grown there, a great, misshapen tooth of the mountain itself. And it was broken. A massive, jagged crack ran from its base all the way to its tip, a dark, ugly scar on its milky white surface. But that was not the worst of it. A network of smaller cracks, like a grotesque spiderweb, spread out from the main fissure, covering the entire crystal. It was a thing that was shattered, a thing that was barely holding itself together. And from every one of these cracks, a dark, oily, gray energy was leaking out. It was not a smoke or a mist. It was a visible corruption, a slow, thick ooze of pure wrongness. It pooled at the base of the crystal, staining the black rock with a greasy sheen, and it rose in slow, lazy tendrils into the thin air, a poison that was dissolving the sky itself. A low, discordant humming sound emanated from the crystal, a sound that was felt more than it was heard. It was a deep, grating vibration that resonated in their bones, the sound of a world in pain. For a long moment, they could only stare in horrified silence. This was the source of all the despair, all the decay, all the sorrow they had witnessed. This one broken thing was killing the world. Seren took a slow, shuffling step forward. She had to try. This was her purpose. This was why she had left her home, why she had endured the long and terrible journey. She was the celestial weaver. She was a mender. Kael moved to follow her, but she held up a hand, a small, silent gesture for him to stay back. This was her work. This was a sickness of the sky, and she had the thread to mend it. She walked slowly toward the monstrous, humming crystal, her feet unsteady on the cracked rock. The closer she got, the more intense the pain in her chest became. The humming of the crystal grew louder, a nauseating vibration that made her feel dizzy. The air around the crystal was thick with the gray, leaking energy, and it felt like she was wading through a cold, invisible swamp. She stopped a few feet from the base of the sky anchor. She could feel the cold radiating from it, a deep, life-draining cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. She reached into the small leather pouch at her side and took out her spool of sunbeam thread. In the dim, gray light of the summit, the thread was a beacon of impossible beauty. It glowed with a pure, warm, golden light, a tiny, captured piece of a healthy sun. It was the essence of warmth, of life, of color. She held it up, and its gentle light pushed back the immediate darkness around her, creating a small, golden bubble of safety in the overwhelming gloom. This was her tool. This was her power. It had mended the sky 1,000 times. It had brought a spark of hope to the dying village. Surely it could work here. With a trembling hand, she unspooled a long length of the glowing thread. She took her silver needle, its surface cool and familiar. She threaded the needle, her movements practiced and sure, a small island of familiar ritual in a sea of terrifying newness. She approached the great crack at the base of the crystal. She was going to put in the first stitch. She was going to begin the great mending. She raised the needle, the golden thread trailing behind it like the tail of a tiny comet. She focused all her will, all her hope, all her power into this single act. She would mend the broken heart of the world. She touched the tip of the needle to the edge of the crack. The moment the silver needle and the golden thread made contact with the corrupt crystal, a terrible thing happened. The low humming of the crystal instantly rose to a high, violent shriek. The dark, gray energy that was leaking from the crack seemed to recoil for a second, and then it lashed out. A tendril of pure, blackish-gray energy shot out and wrapped itself around the beautiful, glowing sunbeam thread. For a moment, there was a struggle. The golden light of the thread fought against the encroaching darkness. It flared brightly, a defiant, silent scream of pure light. But the darkness was too strong. The corrupt energy of the broken anchor was too powerful. The sunbeam thread, which was made of pure light and life, was like a drop of clean water in a barrel of poison. The darkness consumed it. The golden light flickered, sputtered, and died. The thread itself did not just go dark, it dissolved. It turned into a puff of gray, inert dust that blew away in the cold wind. The silver needle fell from her numb fingers and clattered onto the black rock, the sound shockingly loud in the silence. The backlash of energy threw Seren backwards. She landed hard on the cracked ground, the breath knocked out of her. But the physical impact was nothing compared to the spiritual one. The hope that had carried her up this terrible mountain, the core belief in her own purpose, was shattered. Her thread, her light, her very essence as a weaver was not enough. It was less than enough. It was nothing. She looked at her empty hands, and then at the monstrous, shrieking crystal. A wave of despair, colder and more final than anything she had ever felt, washed over her. It was over. They had failed. The world was going to die, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She lay on the cold rock, the fight completely gone from her body and her spirit finally broken. Kael saw it all. He saw her brave approach. He saw the beautiful glowing thread. He saw the violent reaction of the crystal and the tendril of darkness that had destroyed her light. He saw her fall, and he saw the hope extinguish in her eyes. A raw, primal rage filled him. He wanted to pick up a rock and smash it against the crystal. He wanted to scream his fury at the mountain, at the sky, at the cruel fate of his world. But he did not. His anger was a hot, clean fire, and it burned away the last of his fear. He was a man of the earth. He did not think in terms of magic and light. He thought in terms of practical things. He thought about tools. When a wooden handle on an axe breaks, you do not throw the axe away. You make a new handle, a stronger one. Seren's tool had broken. Her thread was not strong enough for this job. They needed a new thread, a stronger thread. He walked over to where Seren lay. He knelt beside her, his movements gentle. He did not try to speak. He simply put a hand on her shoulder, a silent message of support. He then looked at the fallen silver needle and at the spot where the sunbeam thread had turned to dust, a thread of the sky. The old woman's gesture came back to him, clear and sharp in his mind. She had pointed to the sky, and then to Seren's thread. Then she had pointed to the earth, a thread of the earth. And then she had woven her fingers together. His gaze fell upon his own hands, calloused and strong. Hands that had worked the soil, that had built fences, that had wielded an axe. Hands of the earth. And then he looked at his own wrist. Around it, he wore a simple thin cord of brown leather. It was nothing special. It was old and worn. The edges were frayed, and the surface was scarred with 100 tiny scratches and nicks. He had worn it for as long as he could remember. His father had given it to him when he was just a boy, a simple gift braided from the hide of their first cow. It was a piece of his life. It had been with him when he planted his first seeds, when he harvested his first crops. It had been soaked with his sweat and stained with the soil of his farm. It was a part of him. It was his connection to the land, his strength, his history. It was a thread of the earth. He understood. With a clarity that was as bright and certain as the sun, he understood what they had to do. The sky anchor was the bond between the sky and the earth. To mend a bond, you needed both parts. Seren's thread of pure light, of pure sky, was too one-sided. It had no anchor, no connection to the solid world. The darkness of the broken crystal, which was a corruption of both sky and earth, had consumed it easily. They needed a thread that contained both elements, a thread that was as strong as the earth and as bright as the sky, a thread that could bridge the gap, that could heal the wound because it was made of the same two essential parts as the thing that was broken. He looked at Seren. She was still lying on the ground, her eyes closed, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. He gently touched her arm. Her eyes fluttered open, dull and full of despair. He did not smile. This was a moment of great seriousness. He slowly, deliberately, began to untie the leather cord from his wrist. The knot was old and tight, and his fingers were stiff and cold, but he worked at it patiently until it came loose. He held the simple, worn leather cord in the palm of his hand. It was a small, humble thing, but it was full of the strength of the earth, of the sun that had warmed the fields, of the rain that had watered the grass, of a lifetime of hard, honest work. It was full of his life. He held it out to her, an offering, a silent question. Seren looked at the leather cord in his hand. She looked at his steady, serious eyes, and she understood. A tiny flicker of hope, a fragile and tentative flame, was rekindled in the depths of her despair. He was right. The old woman had shown them. She had been so focused on her own craft, her own power, that she had forgotten the most important lesson. She was only half of the solution. She slowly sat up. Her body ached, but her spirit was stirring again. She reached out a trembling hand and took the leather cord from him. It felt warm in her hand, not with a magical heat, but with the simple, residual warmth of his own body. It was solid. It was real. It was a piece of his world. Now, it was her turn. She reached into her pouch again. This time, her hand did not tremble. She took out her spool of sunbeam thread. It was still glowing, a pure and perfect light. She placed it on the ground beside Kael's leather cord. The two objects lay side by side on the black rock. One was a thing of the sky, ethereal, weightless, and glowing with a celestial light. The other was a thing of the earth, solid, worn, and imbued with the quiet strength of a mortal life. They were a perfect opposition, and they were a perfect match. Her work began. This was a weaving unlike any she had ever attempted before. She had no loom, no shuttle. She had only her hands, her skill, and this new, profound understanding. She took the end of the leather cord in one hand and the end of the sunbeam thread in the other. She held them together. Then, with a gentle, practiced motion, she began to twist them. It was a slow and delicate process. She had to coax the two disparate materials to become one. The sunbeam thread, which was as fine as a spider's silk, began to wrap itself around the thicker, rougher leather cord. At first, they were just two separate things, twisted together. But then, a magic began to happen. The magic of weaving, the magic of joining. The light of the sunbeam thread did not just wrap around the leather, it began to sink into it. The pure, golden energy flowed from the thread of light into the thread of earth. The dull brown leather began to change. A faint, warm glow started to emanate from within it. The light was no longer just a surface coating. It was becoming a part of the leather's very substance. At the same time, the leather cord was giving something to the sunbeam thread. It was giving it substance. It was giving it weight. It was giving it an anchor in the real, solid world. The thread of light, which had been so ethereal and easily destroyed, was now bound to the strength and resilience of the earth. Kael watched, his breath held in his chest. He saw his simple, worn cord being transformed. It was still his cord, still scarred with the marks of his life, but now it was glowing with a soft, steady, golden light, as if a tiny piece of the sun was trapped inside it. Seren's hands moved in a blur of focused, graceful motion. She twisted and braided, her fingers weaving the two threads together so perfectly that they became indistinguishable. They were no longer two separate things. They had become one, a single new thread. It was thicker than the sunbeam thread, but finer than the leather cord. It shone with a new kind of light, not the brilliant, fiery light of the sun, but a deep, warm, golden brown glow, like the color of rich, sun-drenched earth. It was a light that was both powerful and gentle, both celestial and terrestrial. It was a thread of perfect balance. It was a thread of hope made real. When she was finished, she held up a long length of the new thread. It shimmered in the cold air, a line of warm, steady light against the backdrop of the gray sky. She looked at Kael, and for the first time since they had reached the summit, she smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it was real. He smiled back, his face full of awe and a deep, quiet pride. They had done it. They had created the tool they needed. Now, it was time to use it. They approached the broken sky anchor together. This time, they would not be defeated. Seren picked up her silver needle from the ground where it had fallen. She threaded it with the new, glowing thread. The thread felt warm and alive in her hands. It had a comforting weight to it. It felt strong. Kael stood beside her. He took the spool that held the rest of the new thread and held it firmly in his two hands. He was the anchor for this new thread. His strength, his connection to the earth, would flow through the thread, giving it the power it needed. He planted his feet firmly on the black rock, his body a solid, unmoving foundation. Seren took a deep breath. She looked at the great, ugly crack in the crystal. The dark energy was still leaking from it, and the horrible humming sound still filled the air. But she was not afraid anymore. She raised the needle. The glowing thread trailed behind it, a line of pure, balanced hope. She leaned forward and, with a steady hand, she pushed the point of the needle into the milky white crystal, right beside the edge of the crack. She pushed the needle through, and then she pulled the thread after it. The first stitch. The moment the new thread touched the crystal, there was a violent reaction, but it was not like before. The dark, gray energy of the crystal recoiled from the glowing thread as if it had been burned. A high, shrieking sound came from the crystal, a sound of pain and rage. But the thread did not dissolve. It held. Its warm, steady light did not flicker. It pulsed, a steady, golden heartbeat against the corruption of the crystal. She pulled the first stitch tight. The two edges of the crack moved, just a fraction of an inch, closer together. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. She made the second stitch and the third. With each stitch, she pulled the two sides of the great wound in the crystal together. It was hard work. The crystal was as hard as diamond, and she had to put all of her strength into pushing the needle through. And with each stitch, the dark energy of the anchor fought back, lashing out at the thread. But the thread was too strong. It was a perfect fusion of sky and earth, and the unbalanced, broken energy of the crystal could not destroy it. It was like trying to fight a fire with water. The thread was the perfect medicine for this specific sickness. She worked her way up the great crack, her movements becoming a steady, focused rhythm. Push, pull, tighten. Push, pull, tighten. Kael stood beside her, his body as still and solid as the mountain itself, feeding her the thread, his strength flowing into her work. They were a single unit, a weaver and her anchor working in perfect harmony. As she stitched, a change began to happen. The ugly, dark energy leaking from the crack began to lessen. The angry, shrieking sound of the crystal began to soften, the pitch lowering back down to a deep hum. But this time, it was a hum that was less discordant, less painful. And a faint, warm light began to grow within the crystal itself, starting from the stitched-up section at the base. It was a pale, milky white light, but it was a clean light, a healthy light. They were not just closing the wound, they were healing it from the inside out. She reached the top of the great crack. One final stitch was needed to seal the wound completely. She took a deep breath. She pushed the needle through one last time. She pulled the glowing thread taut. She tied a small, strong knot, a weaver's knot, the kind that would never come undone. The final stitch was pulled tight. The great mending was complete. For a single, breathtaking moment, there was absolute silence. The humming stopped. The wind died. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. The sky anchor stood before them, whole again, the long crack sealed by a beautiful glowing seam of golden brown light. Then, a single, pure, musical note rang out from the heart of the crystal. It was a note of perfect harmony, a sound of such profound beauty that it brought tears to their eyes. And the crystal began to glow. The faint, milky white light inside it grew brighter and warmer. The light spread through the entire crystal, driving out the last shadows of the gray sickness until the entire massive sky anchor was blazing with a brilliant, warm, golden white light. A wave of pure energy burst from the peak of the mountain. It was not a destructive explosion. It was a wave of life. It was a wave of color, of warmth, of sound, of pure, unadulterated joy. The wave washed over the summit, and the thin layer of ice on the rocks instantly melted. The black rock itself seemed to lose its harsh, dead look, taking on a softer, warmer tone. The wave washed over Seren and Kael, and the deep, bone-weary exhaustion was lifted from them in an instant. The pain in Seren's chest was gone, replaced by a feeling of profound peace and wholeness. The anger in Kael's heart melted away, replaced by a deep and overwhelming love for his world. the wave of healing energy poured down the sides of the mountain. The gray dust dissolved into nothing, revealing the rich, dark soil beneath. The twisted, dead trees straightened, their bark healing, and tiny green buds began to swell on their branches, all in a matter of seconds. The steep, treacherous slopes of scree settled, the loose rocks finding a new stability. From their vantage point on the summit, they watched as the wave of life spread out across the land below. It moved like a fast-moving sunrise, a tide of brilliant color washing over the gray landscape. The grayness did not just fade, it evaporated like mist in the morning sun. The vibrant greens of the forests and fields returned, deeper and richer than before. The blues of the rivers and lakes became a brilliant, sparkling sapphire. The browns of the earth became rich and full of life. They saw the village they had passed through, and they saw the gray dust lift from it like a veil. They saw the people come out of their houses, not shuffling, but running, their faces turned up to the newly blue sky, their arms outstretched, their voices rising in a cheer that Seren and Kael could feel in their hearts, even from this great distance. The sky above them was no longer a thin, pale sheet. It was a deep, rich, perfect blue, the color it was always meant to be. The sun was no longer a weak, pale disk. It was a brilliant, warm, golden presence, pouring its life-giving light and warmth down onto a world that had been reborn. The gray sickness was gone. The world was whole again. The sky and the earth were one, healed by a single thread, and the unbreakable bond between a weaver from the sky and a farmer from the earth. Chapter 8. A home between earth and sky. The world below them was a symphony of color and life. From the healed summit of the mountain, Seren and Kael watched the wave of restoration spread to the furthest corners of the land. It was like watching a painter fill in a black and white drawing with the most brilliant colors imaginable. The deep, vibrant green of the forests returned, 1,000 different shades that spoke of health and new growth. The rivers and lakes, which had been dull, lifeless ribbons of gray, now sparkled with a brilliant, clear blue, reflecting the perfect sky above. The fields of the farmers, which had been barren patches of brown dust, were now lush carpets of green and gold. They could almost feel the collective sigh of relief from the land itself, a deep, contented breath as life flowed back into its veins. The air that reached them on the peak was no longer thin and cold. It was warm and clean, filled with the distant sweet scent of damp earth and blossoming flowers. The silence of the mountaintop was broken by a gentle, steady breeze, and carried on that breeze was the faint, joyful sound of birdsong rising from the newly awakened forests below. The world was singing again. The sky anchor behind them was a beacon of pure, gentle light. It no longer hummed with a discordant, painful energy. It pulsed with a slow, steady, rhythmic beat, a calm and powerful heartbeat that was in perfect harmony with the world. The ugly, jagged crack was gone, replaced by the beautiful, glowing seam they had woven, a permanent and visible reminder of the mending. It was a scar, but it was a scar of healing, a mark of a wound that had been closed and made whole again. Kael walked to the edge of the plateau and looked down at his world. The anger and the grim determination that had driven him up the mountain were gone, replaced by a quiet, profound sense of peace. He saw his land, his home, not as a thing to be fought for, but as a thing to be loved. He felt a connection to it that was deeper than ever before, a sense of belonging that resonated in his very soul. Seren stood beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm. The constant gnawing pain she had felt from the unraveling sky had been replaced by a feeling of serene wholeness. She felt the sky above her not as a separate entity she had to maintain, but as a part of her, an extension of her own being. It was strong, it was vibrant, it was complete. She felt a contentment that was deeper and more meaningful than the simple, solitary peace she had known on Cloudhaven. Nimbus, her mist cat, had been a small, condensed ball of white for most of the climb. Now he unfurled. His misty form expanded, becoming light and airy. He stretched his silent, vaporous wings and floated from Seren's shoulder, circling the summit in a slow, graceful dance. He was no longer a creature of anxiety and fear. He was a being of pure, joyful mist, a small, happy cloud celebrating the return of the healthy sky. He swooped and soared on the gentle updrafts, a silent expression of the profound relief they all felt. The descent from the mountain was nothing like the terrible climb. The path that had been a treacherous, shifting nightmare of loose rock and dust was now a stable, firm trail. The gray dust was gone, replaced by rich, dark earth. Small, resilient mountain flowers in vibrant shades of purple and yellow were already beginning to push their way up through the soil, their faces turned to the warm sun. The steep slopes of scree had settled, the rocks locked into a new and safe stability. The narrow, windy ledges were no longer assailed by the shrieking, chaotic gusts of a sick mountain. A gentle, steady breeze now blew, a helpful and friendly presence that seemed to whisper words of encouragement. The journey down was not a struggle for survival. It was a peaceful, joyful walk through a world that was celebrating its own rebirth. They did not need to fight the mountain anymore. The mountain was their friend. They moved with a light and easy stride, their bodies free from the crushing exhaustion that had plagued them on the way up. They passed through the small, sheltered hollow where the keeper of the mountain lived. The moss on her hut seemed a brighter green, the flowers in her garden more vibrant. The round door was closed, and they knew they would not see her again. Her work was done. She had been the silent guardian of the mountain's secret, waiting for the ones who could bring the healing. They paused for a moment, bowing their heads in a silent gesture of thanks to the wise old woman and her hidden sanctuary of life. Then they continued on their way, leaving the mountain's high places behind them. As they reached the foothills, they began to encounter the people of the land. The first person they saw was a shepherd, a young boy who was guiding his flock of sheep across a newly green hillside. When he saw them coming down from the mountain, his eyes went wide with awe. He knew the stories. He knew that the mountain was a place of fear, the source of the gray sickness. To see two people walking down from its peak, looking not broken and defeated, but calm and full of a quiet light, was to see a miracle. He took off his simple cap and held it over his heart, a gesture of pure, unadorned respect. Further on, as they walked through the now lush and vibrant farmlands, they came to the village where they had performed the small act of mending. The change was breathtaking. The village was no longer a silent gray place of despair. It was bustling with life and energy. The houses were being repaired, the sound of hammers on wood ringing through the air. The gardens were being cleared of the dead weeds, the rich, dark soil turned over to receive new seeds. The people were not shuffling with their heads down. They were walking with purpose, their faces bright, their voices full of laughter and conversation. The pillar of light they had created above the well was gone, but it was no longer needed. The entire sky was a brilliant, warm blue. The children were running and playing in the square, their joyful shouts a beautiful music. The people saw them coming. They recognized them. They were the two strangers who had brought the first spark of hope. A great cheer went up. The villagers rushed to greet them, surrounding them, touching their hands, their clothes, their faces full of a profound and overwhelming gratitude. They offered them food, the best bread, the sweetest apples. They offered them water from the now clean and sparkling well. Seren and Kael accepted their offerings with humble grace. They had not sought thanks or praise, but to receive it, to see the direct result of their struggle in the happy, hopeful faces of these people was a deeply moving experience. They did not stay long. They were not heroes seeking a celebration. They were simply two people who had done what needed to be done. They smiled, they nodded their thanks, and they continued on their journey south, leaving behind a village that was not just healed, but reborn with a new and powerful sense of community and hope. The rest of the journey back to Kael's farm was a peaceful and beautiful walk. The world was a constant delight to the senses. The air was sweet, the colors were bright, and the sounds were a symphony of life. They walked through the great forest, but it was no longer a dark and intimidating place. It was a cathedral of green light, a place of deep peace and ancient wisdom. They crossed the river, not on a treacherous, slippery log, but by wading through the cool, clear water, which was now shallower and gentler. The journey that had been a long and arduous struggle was now a gentle, contemplative stroll. They had time to talk, not with words, but with shared smiles, with quiet glances, with the comfortable and easy silence of two people who had been through the deepest of trials together and had come out the other side, changed forever. They finally arrived back at the edge of the woods that bordered Kael's farm. The familiar sight of his small, sturdy cottage and his neat green fields was a welcome one. It was a symbol of the simple, good life they had fought to save. But as they stood there, on the edge of the path, a new and difficult reality began to settle in. Their journey was over. Their quest was complete. And now, a decision had to be made. Seren looked up at the perfect blue sky. High above, so high it was just a tiny, indistinct white speck, she could see Cloudhaven, her home. Her work was not truly finished. She was still the celestial weaver. The sky was healthy now, but it would always need tending. Storms would come again. Time would wear the fabric thin. Her duty was there, in her small cottage, at her great loom. She had to go back. The thought of returning to her solitary life was now a source of deep and profound sadness. Before, she had been content in her quiet, peaceful world. But she was not the same person who had descended from the sky on a rope of woven light. She had felt the solid earth beneath her feet. She had tasted its food, felt its pain, and shared in its healing. She had known friendship. She had known fear and courage. She had known the powerful, unbreakable bond of shared purpose. To return to a life of silent, lonely work, even a life of great importance, felt like returning to a cage, however beautiful and gilded. Her world had become so much larger, and she did not want to shrink it back to the size of a single cloud. Most of all, the thought of leaving Kael was an ache in her heart that was almost as sharp as the pain of the unraveling sky had been. He was a part of her now. He was the earth to her sky. To separate them felt unnatural, wrong, a tearing of a fabric they had just so carefully woven together. Kael felt the same conflict. He looked at his farm, at his home. This was his life, his purpose. He was a farmer. His hands belonged in this soil. He was meant to live under the open sky, not on a cloud. But the thought of Seren leaving, of watching her climb back up that shimmering rope and disappear into the blue, was unbearable. His small cottage, which had always been a place of comfort and sufficiency, now seemed quiet and empty without her gentle presence. He could not imagine his mornings without her sense of wonder, his evenings without her quiet companionship. She had brought a kind of magic into his solid, practical world, and he did not want to let it go. His life on the farm, which had once been his whole world, now felt like only half a world without her. They stood there in the quiet sunlight, the unspoken sadness a heavy weight between them. They had healed the great rift between the sky and the earth, but now a rift was opening between their own two lives. The solution, when it came, was as simple and as natural as the weaving of the final thread. It was not a grand decision made with many words. It was a quiet understanding that grew between them, a recognition of a new and beautiful truth. They did not have to choose. They did not have to be separate. They had woven the sky and the earth together to heal the world. Now they would weave their two lives together to heal themselves. Kael looked at Seren, and then he looked up at the tiny white speck of Cloudhaven. He then looked at his own two hands, the hands of a farmer. He smiled a slow, gentle smile. He could be a farmer anywhere. Seren looked at Kael, and then at her own two hands, the hands of a weaver. She smiled back. She could be a weaver anywhere, but she would rather be a weaver with him. They made a new decision together, a new plan. Kael would come with her. He would make his home with her, on her island in the sky. They went to his cottage, and Kael gathered a few precious things. He did not take his tools. He took a small bag of seeds from his best vegetables. He took a small, smooth stone from his hearth. And most importantly, he went to his garden and, with his strong hands, he dug up a large amount of his best, richest, darkest soil, filling a large wooden box with the life-giving earth of his home. These were the pieces of his world he would bring to hers. They walked back to the meadow where Seren's journey had begun. The rope of woven light was still there, hanging from the sky, a shimmering, magical ladder. It had waited for her, a patient and faithful connection to her old life, but she would not be returning to her old life. She would be starting a new one. Kael secured the box of soil to his back. He looked around at the green trees and the solid ground one last time, not with sadness, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who was not leaving his home, but taking the best part of it with him. He took hold of the rope. Seren stood beside him, her hand on his. Together, they began to climb. For Kael, the ascent was a strange and wonderful experience. The solid world shrank below him, becoming the beautiful, abstract pattern that Seren had always known. The feeling of weightlessness, of floating up into the endless blue, was a thrilling and liberating sensation. He was a man of the earth, but he was not afraid of the sky. They arrived back on Cloudhaven. Kael stepped onto the soft, yielding surface of the cloud, his eyes wide with wonder. He had lived his whole life on the hard, unmoving ground. To stand on a cloud, to feel it gently sway beneath his feet, was a miracle. He looked at Seren's small cottage, at its pearly white walls and its roof of woven starlight. It was a place of quiet magic, a perfect home. Their life together became a beautiful and seamless blend of their two worlds. Seren returned to her work at her great loom, but it was no longer a solitary task. Kael would sit with her, watching her hands as they wove the threads of light. He would tell her stories of the world below, of the seasons, of the growing of plants, of the lives of the people. He gave her work a new context, a new meaning. She was no longer just mending a beautiful, abstract fabric. She was protecting his world, the world of the people in the village, the world of the shepherd boy and his sheep. She wove with a new purpose, a new love for the world she served. And Kael did not leave his own work behind. He took the large box of soil he had brought, and he built a small, beautiful garden right on the surface of the cloud. He planted his seeds, and in the constant, gentle warmth of the sun-kissed cloud, they grew with an incredible vitality. Soon, a patch of vibrant green life existed on Cloudhaven, a small piece of the earth thriving in the heart of the sky. He grew bright red tomatoes and dark green lettuces and brilliant orange carrots. He brought the explosive, solid flavors of his world to their home in the clouds. Their days found a new and perfect rhythm. In the mornings, Seren would mend the sky, her shuttle flying back and forth on the great loom, a quiet, steady heartbeat. Kael would tend his garden, his hands in the rich, dark earth, his face turned to the sun. In the afternoons, they would sit together at the edge of the cloud, eating the fresh vegetables from his garden, and they would look down at the beautiful, healthy world spread out below them. Nimbus, their silent companion, would curl up between them, a soft, content ball of mist, a perfect symbol of their peaceful, shared life. Seren, the weaver of the sky, and Kael, the farmer of the earth, had found their true purpose. It was not just to mend the sky or to till the soil. It was to be together, their home a perfect and permanent symbol of the unbreakable bond they had woven, not just with their hands, but with their hearts. A home that was a perfect harmony between the earth and the sky.